People vanish from America's most remote forests every year. Not lost, not dead, but completely erased, as if the wilderness itself reaches out and pulls them in. Some disappear mid-stride on impossible trails. Others are found in sealed locations that hadn't been opened for decades. And a few leave behind evidence of places they should never have been able to reach. These aren't stories of simple hikers getting lost. These are cases where physics breaks down and search teams discover proof that something has rewritten reality itself. At Verified Fears, we've compiled the 11 most disturbing disappearances, where the forest didn't just claim its victims. It kept the evidence of what it did. The autumn of 2003 arrived in Freetown Fall River State Forest like a slow suffocation. Hendricks had been working as a park ranger for the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation for nearly 17 years. And in all that time, he'd never felt truly unsettled by the woods. He knew them the way a sailor knows the ocean, respectfully, cautiously, but with the confidence of someone who learned to read the rhythms and warnings hidden in the natural world. But October 2003 was different. The Bridgewater Triangle, that mysterious stretch of Massachusetts where Freetown sat, nested like a dark secret, had been reporting an unusual number of disturbances that autumn. Hikers were calling in about strange voices echoing through the pines, equipment malfunctioning for no apparent reason, and a peculiar quality to the silence that made even seasoned outdoorsmen uncomfortable. Hendricks had been assigned to investigate reports of illegal activity, unauthorized camps, destroyed equipment, and evidence of what locals whispered about in low voices. Ritual sites, occult symbols carved into trees, and circles of scorched earth where nothing would grow. On October 23rd, Hendricks left the ranger station at dawn in his marked truck, heading toward the northern perimeter where most of the recent disturbances had been reported. He carried his standard equipment: radio, flashlight, compass, field notebook, and a camera for documentation. His supervisor, Bryce Aldridge, logged him out at 5:47 a.m. with a standard check-in scheduled for 2:00 p.m. Hendricks drove the access roads with deliberate slowness, cataloging the forest around him, noting the way the morning mist clung to the undergrowth and how the canopy seemed to block out more sunlight than it should at that hour. The radio crackled occasionally, routine traffic from other rangers on duty. And Hendricks responded in his typical clipped, professional manner. Around 8:30 a.m., nearly 3 hours into his patrol, he made a call to report his position and condition. "Ranger Webb at Checkpoint 7, all normal," he'd said, his voice steady through the static. Those words would be the last anyone ever heard from him. The scheduled 2:00 p.m. check-in came and went in silence. Bryce waited until 2:15 p.m. before attempting to raise Hendricks on the radio, calling repeatedly without response. At first, there was no concern. Radios malfunctioned sometimes, especially deep in the forest where the dense canopy created dead zones. But when 4:00 p.m. arrived, and still no signal, Bryce initiated protocol. He called other rangers to begin a preliminary sweep of the northern sector, specifically checking the access roads and main patrol routes Hendricks had mentioned in his morning briefing. The search remained casual, almost routine, until sunset when a ranger discovered Hendricks's truck parked exactly where it should have been, parked near Checkpoint 7. Everything about the scene was wrong. The truck's engine was still running. The headlights were on despite the fading afternoon light, and the radio was producing continuous static, as if broadcasting into an empty void. When the ranger approached, he noticed something that sent ice through his veins. The truck's doors were locked from the outside, all 4 of them secure and undisturbed. Through the window, the ranger could see the keys still hanging in the ignition, the engine rumbling softly in the gathering dusk. Hendrix's field notebook lay on the passenger seat. His camera sat on the dashboard, and his radio was clipped to the sun visor where he always kept it. Everything a ranger would need to survive in the woods remained perfectly organized inside the vehicle. Everything except Hendrix himself. What happened next escalated the situation into something that would consume the attention of state police, park rangers, and search and rescue teams for weeks. When they forced open the truck door and began examining the interior, they discovered something that defied explanation. The dashboard was covered, completely covered, in handprints. Dozens of them. They appeared on the steering wheel, the dashboard, the inside of the windows, pressed against the glass from within the cab. But here was the impossible part. Forensic analysis would later reveal that these handprints came from at least 4 different people, none of them matching Hendrix's hand size or dermal patterns. In a locked vehicle with no signs of forced entry, the doors never opened from the inside. Investigators found evidence that multiple other individuals had been inside that truck with Hendrix. The handprints weren't frantic or violent. They weren't smeared or desperate. They were deliberate, placed, pressed against surfaces as if whoever they belonged to was standing calmly inside the cab of a locked vehicle, hands against the glass, observing something outside. Forensic experts brought in from Massachusetts State Police studied the prints in confusion. They couldn't identify any matches in their database. They weren't animal prints, which the forest rangers immediately insisted they weren't. They weren't children's hands. The size was wrong. They were adult human hands, perfectly formed, perfectly ordinary, except for their impossible presence in that sealed truck. Hendrix's final patrol logs, retrieved from the truck, documented his movements throughout the morning. His handwriting grew progressively more erratic as the day continued. The first entries were neat and precise: timestamps, locations, observations about trail conditions and equipment status. But by 11:30 a.m., his handwriting had deteriorated into something almost illegible. His final entry was just a single sentence repeated 4 times across an entire page. "They're in here with me." The words grew larger with each repetition, the pen pressing harder into the paper until the final iteration nearly tore through. The entry was time-stamped 11:43 a.m., more than 2 hours before Bryce's initial attempts to reach him on the radio. The search for Hendrix Walden expanded rapidly. Bloodhounds tracked his scent from the truck in multiple directions, but within 100 yards, every trail went dead. Not lost, but stopped, as if his scent simply vanished into the air. Teams searched the forest systematically for weeks, expanding outward in concentric circles from Checkpoint 7. They searched the surrounding ravines, the thick stands of pine where a body could be hidden for years, the bog areas and rocky outcrops. They found nothing. No clothing, no body, no trace of Hendrix beyond his truck, and that disturbing notebook filled with his increasingly fractured observations. The case files noted something else recovered from Hendrix's truck that the media never reported. His camera contained 247 photographs from that morning. The first 200 were standard ranger documentation: trail conditions, debris sites, areas requiring maintenance. But the final 47 photographs were all identical, all taken from inside the truck, all showing the exact same image: the empty passenger seat beside him. In every photograph, the passenger seat appeared occupied, not by a visible figure, but by a presence, by a distortion in the air, by something that the camera registered but human eyes couldn't perceive. The images showed depression in the upholstery, as if someone was sitting there. The final photograph was taken at 11:42 a.m., 1 minute before his desperate entry in the notebook. Hendricks vanished that October morning, and the Freetown Fall River State Forest kept whatever took him. The locals stopped asking questions after a while. The official report filed with the state attributed his disappearance to possible suicide, though no body was ever found and no motive was ever established. The handprints in the truck remained unidentified. The photographs with their ghostly passenger seat were eventually sealed in evidence storage. But if you venture into that forest on late October afternoons, if you drive those access roads and past Checkpoint 7, locals say that sometimes you'll see a marked ranger truck parked there. The engine will be running, the headlights will be on. And if you look in the windows, you might see the dashboard is covered in handprints that weren't there moments before. The new moon rises in September, like a promise no one should trust. Maximiliano had spent the last 3 months in Maine, conducting one of the most detailed studies of nocturnal wildlife migration patterns the state had ever commissioned. His research required him to venture into the backcountry of Randolph Forest during the darkest nights, documenting owl movements, tracking bat populations, and cataloging the mysterious nocturnal creatures that stirred in those dense woods when the sun vanished. He was 32 years old, a doctoral candidate from the University of Maine with a meticulous mind and an almost obsessive attention to detail. His funding had been generous, his timeline demanding, and his determination unwavering. By September 1987, he was approaching the critical phase of his research, the new moon period when darkness was absolute, and the animals behaved most distinctly according to his preliminary observations. Maximiliano rode his mountain bike into Randolph Forest on September 18th at 6:47 p.m., just as the last traces of daylight were retreating beyond the tree line. His bike was fitted with a modified light system, LED equipment, that was cutting edge for 1987, able to illuminate his path without disrupting the creatures he was studying. He carried 2 specialized cameras with thermal imaging capabilities, recording devices, a leather-bound notebook for immediate observations, and enough supplies to sustain him for a 30-hour expedition. The forest access roads were well-maintained, relatively flat, perfect for cycling even in complete darkness once your eyes adjusted. Maximiliano had mapped his route meticulously, planning to cycle through 7 specific checkpoint zones throughout the night, spending approximately 3 hours at each location conducting observations and recordings. He was staying at a small cottage 10 miles from the forest and planned to return by 2:01 p.m. the following day for a full day of rest before the next night's expedition. His first checkpoint at 7:15 p.m. was reached without incident. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, the distant calls of owls beginning their nightly hunts, the wind moving through pine needles in patterns that seemed almost musical. Maximiliano documented everything in his meticulous handwriting. Temperature was 43 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity at 72%, wind coming from the northwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. Animal activity was moderate, matching the baseline data he'd collected on previous new moon nights. Everything was normal. Everything was perfect. He spent 3 hours at Checkpoint 1, recording approximately 40 minutes of video, taking detailed notes, and photographing the thermal signatures of various creatures moving through the undergrowth. By 10:15 p.m., he was back on his bike, pedaling deeper into the forest toward Checkpoint 2. The cycling between checkpoints was where Maximiliano began to notice something subtly wrong. The darkness was total, absolute in a way that seemed unnatural, even accounting for the new moon. His LED lights, which typically projected a clean cone of illumination extending 40 feet ahead of him, seemed somehow diminished. The beam felt like it was being absorbed by something in the air itself. as if the darkness was a physical substance resisting the light. Maximiliano attributed this to atmospheric conditions, perhaps increased particulate matter or moisture in the air, and continued pedaling. The trail beneath his tires was familiar, the route memorized from previous expeditions. He shouldn't need the lights anyway. He knew every curve, every slight incline, every place where the road widened or narrowed. His body moved through the darkness with confidence born from repetition. But something was fundamentally different about this particular night. And by 11:30 p.m., when Maximiliano should have reached checkpoint 2, he was still cycling through unchanging forest. The landscape hadn't evolved. He'd passed no landmarks that should have appeared 2 hours into his journey. His internal clock, always reliable, suggested he'd been riding for nearly an hour longer than the distance should require. Maximiliano slowed his bike and checked his odometer, a mechanical device that couldn't malfunction, couldn't lie. According to the measurement, he'd traveled only 2.4 miles. According to his route planning, checkpoint 2 should be 4.5 miles from checkpoint 1. He was exactly 2.1 miles short of where he should be. Maximiliano pulled over and consulted his map, positioning his flashlight carefully so the beam wouldn't disturb nocturnal animals. The map showed no obstacles, no detours, nothing that would explain why he hadn't reached his destination. He decided to push harder, pedaling with renewed intensity, determined to make up the distance. The forest raced past him now, branches whipping closer as his focus narrowed to the small cone of light ahead. His breathing became rapid, controlled, the physical exertion clearing his mind. The road beneath his tires felt solid, the path firm and well-defined. But the forest refused to change. The trees on either side remained uniform, their spacing identical, their height consistent. Maximiliano's rational mind struggled against an irrational growing conviction. He was cycling in place, moving through the same section of forest repeatedly, caught in some kind of nightmare loop. At 1:47 a.m., after what should have been approximately 6 hours of riding, Maximiliano's odometer still showed only 3.8 miles traveled. He was now only 0.7 miles from checkpoint 1, having somehow curved backward through the forest without recognizing it. He stopped the bike completely and sat in the darkness, his breathing the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. For the first time, Maximiliano noticed that the forest had grown entirely quiet. No owl calls, no rustling of nocturnal mammals, no wind through the pines. Complete silence. The absence of sound was more terrifying than any noise could have been. His heart was pounding now, his scientific objectivity crumbling under the weight of something he couldn't rationalize. He removed his notebook and began writing observations in the darkness, feeling rather than seeing the pen against paper. 2:15 a.m. Directional confusion, spatial anomaly, forest behavior inconsistent with previous nights, silence absolute, lights on bike malfunctioning or environment absorbing light, recommend withdrawal. He considered abandoning the expedition, cycling directly back toward the entrance, toward civilization, toward the cottage waiting 10 miles distant. But then he saw them. At the absolute edge of his LED light's reach, where the darkness transitioned into the faint illumination, Maximiliano saw shapes moving between the trees. Multiple shapes, moving with purpose, moving with intelligence. They weren't deer. The silhouettes were wrong. They weren't bears. The movement pattern was wrong. They were roughly human-shaped, but the proportions were distorted, elongated, wrong. Maximiliano watched as one of the shapes turned to face him directly, and even from 30 feet away, even shrouded in darkness, He could sense that it was looking at him. Not past him, not through him, at him. More shapes emerged from between the trees, all turning now, all facing his direction. The forest had stopped being silent. Now it was generating sound, a low humming that seemed to resonate through the trees themselves, a frequency that made Maximiliano's teeth ache. He kicked off on his bike with desperate panic, pedaling with strength born from pure terror. The shapes were moving now, matching his speed, moving between the trees parallel to his path. Maximiliano pedaled faster, his breath coming in gasps, his muscles burning with exertion. The forest began to blur around him, trees flashing past, the ground becoming uncertain beneath his tires. His LED light bounced wildly with his violent pedaling, creating strobing illumination that showed him glimpses of the shapes keeping pace, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind, always moving with perfect synchronization to his own velocity. The humming grew louder, more intense, forming patterns almost like words, almost like language. Maximiliano's leg muscles screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, couldn't deviate from the desperate race forward. At 3:47 a.m., Maximiliano burst out of the forest entirely, flying across the dirt road that marked the perimeter, his bike leaving the ground as he hit the transition between forest and clearing. His front wheel hit a rock and the bicycle flipped, launching him forward onto the pavement. He crashed hard, his body skidding across asphalt, his skin peeling open from the friction. He lay there, bleeding, gasping for breath, unable to move. Behind him, at the forest's edge, everything was darkness. The shapes had stopped at the perimeter. They didn't emerge into the open. They simply stood there, silhouetted against the deeper blackness of the forest, watching him bleed on the road. Maximiliano crawled toward his abandoned bike and somehow managed to get it moving again despite injuries that made every movement agony. He cycled back to his cottage, reporting nothing to anyone. His research was never published. His thermal imaging cameras contained no footage of the shapes. But the final entry in his research notebook, found years later in an estate sale, read, 3:52 a.m. They stopped at the tree line. They were waiting for me to leave the forest. They were protecting something. They wanted me to know I was not meant to find it. I will not return. Maximiliano left Maine 3 days later and never spoke publicly about his expedition. But locals in Randolph still report a cyclist on the forest roads at night. A figure in old-style gear, pedaling frantically on a bike that seems too damaged to function. His path forming loops and circles that never progress, never advance, forever caught between checkpoint 1 and checkpoint 2, forever trying to escape whatever keeps him cycling through that dark forest. The darkness inside Dark Entry Forest feels like a living thing. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but as a tangible, breathing entity that consumes light and sound with deliberate hunger. Zaire had been studying the remnants of Dudleytown's curse for her doctoral thesis in American folklore at Yale University. And the summer of 1978 seemed like the perfect opportunity to conduct an intensive investigation. She was a meticulous researcher, the kind of scholar who didn't just read about history but insisted on living it, breathing it, understanding it through immersion. With her were 2 fellow graduate students, Reed, who specialized in architectural history and was obsessed with documenting the ghost town's remaining structures, and Bodie, who claimed expertise in paranormal phenomena and had brought expensive recording equipment and thermal imaging cameras that would prove utterly useless in the darkness that consumed all light in that forest. They arrived at the Dark Entry Forest access point on July 19, 1978, in early afternoon. The 3 of them were experienced campers, well equipped with supplies, shelter, and documentation equipment. Their plan was ambitious. A full week living on site, conducting daily surveys of the Dudleytown ruins, interviewing locals about the curse's history, and gathering audio and visual documentation of the site's paranormal activity, if such activity existed. Zaire was skeptical about the supernatural aspects, but respected her colleagues' beliefs. She was there for the history, the sociology of mass disappearance, the psychological impact of community dissolution. Reed and Bodie were there for the unexplained. The three of them set up camp just outside the forest proper, on cleared land where afternoon sun still reached, establishing their base before venturing into the woods proper. The forest itself began approximately 200 meters from their campsite, marked by a subtle transition where the deciduous forest gave way to something older, denser, more oppressive. The trees in Dark Entry were predominantly hemlock and white pine, species that grew so densely they created a perpetual twilight even in midday. Local histories describe the area's darkness as supernatural, a curse inherited from Dudleytown's mysterious abandonment in the 1800s. Families had vanished. Illnesses had swept through despite no apparent vector. Children had gone mad. And one by one the residents had abandoned the settlement until nothing remained but crumbling foundations and the weight of collective tragedy pressing down through the centuries. Zaire documented all of this methodically in her notebook. Reed began sketching the architectural remains. Bodie set up recording devices, positioning sensitive microphones throughout the campsite to capture whatever sounds the forest produced at night. On their second day, July 20th, Reed discovered something unusual while exploring the Dudleytown ruins. The foundation of what had been the central meeting house contained markings, symbols carved into the stone with meticulous precision. Not random scratches or vandalism, but deliberate symbols arranged in geometric patterns. Bodie photographed them extensively, while Zaire documented their locations and the characteristics of the stone. The symbols didn't match any known regional indigenous markings. They didn't correspond to any occult notation either, at least not any that Bodie recognized. But something about them created an inexplicable sense of unease. That night, the three researchers sat in their camp, a fire burning in a metal pit, and discussed what they'd found. Reed hypothesized about cult activity. Bodie suggested something older, something pre-colonial. Zaire recommended careful documentation and rational analysis. The conversation faded as darkness fell. Around 2:30 a.m. on July 21st, all three of their recording devices activated simultaneously. Bodie woke to find every piece of equipment running, consuming batteries, registering activity despite no one having activated them. He woke Reed and Zaire, and the three gathered around the devices, watching in fascination as audio meters jumped and thermal cameras registered anomalies throughout the campsite. Something was present. Something was generating heat signatures, producing sound waves, existing in their camp in complete darkness. Bodie's equipment suggested three distinct presences moving in circles around their tents. Zaire rationalized animals, thermal artifact, equipment malfunction. Reed stood watch, wanting to see whatever was creating the signatures. For 3 hours, they documented the activity. Then, at 5:47 a.m., everything stopped. The recording ceased. The anomalies disappeared. And as dawn light began filtering through the forest canopy, normal campsite sounds resumed. They investigated their perimeter thoroughly in the morning, finding no tracks, no evidence of animal activity, no logical explanation for the night's recordings. Bodie wanted to abandon the site, but Zaire insisted they continue. This was exactly the kind of data they needed, unexplained phenomena that required investigation rather than retreat. Reed agreed, suggesting they expand their recording coverage. They spent July 21st securing additional equipment, expanding their sensor net, fortifying their camp with larger fires and better lighting. That evening, they attempted to make contact with whatever had visited them the previous night. Bodhi led a ritualistic approach, using the symbols they'd photographed from the Dudleytown ruins, attempting to communicate with whatever entity might be attracted to such markings. Reed read historical accounts of the town's dissolution. Zaire documented everything, maintaining her scientific objectivity even as the sun set and the forest's darkness reasserted its dominion. The second night was different. The recordings activated again around 2:15 a.m., but this time they captured something more disturbing than thermal anomalies or undefined sounds. Bodhi's most sensitive microphone captured voices, whispered, urgent, speaking in unison. The audio was nearly impossible to understand, but phonetic analysis later suggested words in a language no one could identify. The temperature around the camp dropped 17 degrees in under 4 minutes. Ice formed on their tent exteriors despite the summer season, and the recording devices captured visual evidence that made no logical sense. Thermal imaging showed shadows moving inside their sealed tents with them, not reflections of external movement, but figures, humanoid silhouettes, standing beside each researcher while they slept, hands extended, touching them. By July 22nd, something fundamental had shifted in the three researchers' understanding of their situation. They had documented phenomena that contradicted every rational framework they possessed. Bodhi was openly frightened, suggesting immediate evacuation. Reed remained fascinated, wanting to continue the investigation despite visible fear in his expressions. Zaire had grown quiet, spending hours reviewing the recordings, watching the footage of impossible figures standing beside her sleeping form. That morning, she made a decision. They would stay one more night, but they would not sleep. They would maintain complete vigilance and attempt to understand what was happening. That evening, as darkness fell, all three sat around a campfire, watching the forest edge, waiting for whatever came in the night. The final transmission came from Bodhi's recording equipment, discovered weeks later by search and rescue teams. It was approximately 72 hours of silence. Complete, absolute silence. No ambient forest sounds, no animal noises, no wind or rain. Just emptiness. Then, during the 72nd hour, all three researchers' voices appeared simultaneously on the recording, whispering in perfect unison. "We're still here. We're still here. We're still here." The phrase repeated exactly 17 times before the recording cut off permanently. When authorities arrived at the campsite on July 26th, responding to a missed check-in call from Yale University, they found the camp in perfect condition. The tents were erected properly. The fire pit contained wood arranged as if waiting to be lit. The research equipment was arranged meticulously across folding tables. Meals prepared on July 22nd remained on plates, untouched, beginning to decay. The documentation notebooks lay open on a central table, filled with increasingly erratic handwriting as the days progressed. But Zaire, Reed, and Bodhi were gone. No bodies were found despite weeks of searching. No tracks led away from the campsite. No evidence suggested foul play, abduction, or accidental death. The three researchers had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only their equipment, their recordings, and the mystery of what dark entry forest takes when the darkness falls. Officially, the case was closed as a murder-suicide scenario that was never solved. But the recordings remain archived at Yale University, And anyone who has listened to the full 72-hour documentation reports the same phenomenon. No matter how many times you listen to the final timestamp, you always hear one additional voice beneath the researchers' unified whisper. A fourth voice saying something different, something that sounds like an invitation. The Earth in Devil's Tramping Ground refuses to live. That's the first thing Brian noticed when he arrived at the site on a cold March morning in 1991. Stepping out of his rental car and walking toward the phenomenon that had drawn curiosity seekers and paranormal investigators for over a century. A perfect circle, 40 feet in diameter, stripped completely bare of vegetation. No grass, no moss, no lichen, nothing but barren red soil in the shape of something deliberately drawn by nature or something far older than nature. Brian Castellanos was an investigative journalist with a reputation for debunking folklore and exposing the human psychology behind mass paranoia. He'd written extensively about unexplained phenomena, always finding rational explanations, hoaxes, misidentification, selective memory. But Devil's Tramping Ground in Bennett, North Carolina, had proven remarkably resistant to rationalization. Whatever maintained this circle, whatever prevented anything from growing within its boundaries, defied conventional botanical explanation. The legend was straightforward enough. The devil himself walked this circle at night, pacing as he plotted evil, his footsteps burning the earth beneath him. Anyone foolish enough to sleep inside the circle would never wake. Objects left inside would be thrown out by morning. Animals refused to enter. Plants withered at the soil's edge. And the circle had existed, documented and unchanged, for over 200 years. Brian had spent 3 months researching the historical records, interviewing park rangers, consulting with soil scientists. Everything pointed toward either underground toxins, concentrated salt deposits, or some kind of deliberate hoax maintained by locals. None of those explanations felt quite right when he stood at the circle's edge and looked at the impossible perfection of its boundary. A sharp demarcation between living earth and barren ground, as if someone had literally drawn a line and said, "Nothing lives here. Nothing ever will." Brian had decided to spend a night inside the circle. He would document the experience, temperature fluctuations, audio recordings, thermal imaging, comprehensive note-taking. He would sleep inside the infamous boundary and wake up to prove that the legend was nothing more than folklore, that the devil was not prowling North Carolina forests, and that rational investigation could dispel superstition. He arrived with his equipment at 4 p.m. on March 15, 1991, setting up his camp directly in the center of the circle. He placed temperature sensors at equidistant points along the perimeter. He positioned recording devices throughout his camp. He set up his sleeping bag in the exact center. He was methodical, professional, committed to scientific rigor. Local authorities had been notified of his presence. A ranger would check on him at 9 a.m. the following morning. Everything was documented, everything was prepared, and everything was about to go catastrophically wrong in ways that no amount of scientific equipment could explain. As twilight approached, Brian noticed the first anomaly. The temperature inside the circle was dropping far more rapidly than the external temperature. His instruments showed a 17-degree differential by 6:30 p.m. Outside the circle, the temperature had stabilized at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. But inside the boundary, it had plummeted to 28 degrees. Brian checked his equipment repeatedly, ensuring there were no malfunctions, no errors in calibration. The readings were consistent. Somehow, the circle itself was generating cold. He documented this phenomenon in his notebook with meticulous detail, drawing diagrams and recording timestamp observations. By 7 p.m., as darkness fell completely, Brian could see his breath in visible clouds, and frost was beginning to form on the grass at the circle's edge, despite the external temperature remaining above freezing. The second anomaly came around 8 p.m. Brian heard footsteps. Not animal sounds, the distinct pattern of human footsteps walking around the circle's perimeter, step after deliberate step, maintaining a steady pace. Brian grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but the beam illuminated nothing. No figure, no animal, no visible source for the footsteps. Yet the sound continued. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The soft impact of boots on earth, circling the boundary endlessly. Brian's pulse elevated. He reminded himself to remain rational, to consider alternative explanations. Wind could create sounds that simulated footsteps. Animals could move through brush in patterns that sounded deliberate. But as he listened more carefully, the footsteps seemed to match his own breathing pattern, seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat, as if they were responding to him rather than existing independently. By midnight, Brian had largely overcome his initial fear. He was a professional. He was documenting impossible phenomena through the lens of careful observation. He had filled 3 pages of his notebook with detailed accounts of temperature anomalies, audio patterns, and electromagnetic fluctuations that his equipment registered. He had placed himself in the center of a legendary location and was gathering data that could form the basis of a compelling article. Around 1:30 a.m., Brian decided to attempt sleep. He documented enough baseline data. The circle seemed to be generating cold and creating sound, but nothing remotely as dramatic as legend suggested. He climbed into his sleeping bag, positioned himself in the center of the circle, and attempted to rest. He didn't sleep. Something about the location created a persistent state of anxious alertness that sleep couldn't overcome. Instead, Brian lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the footsteps continue their endless circuit around him. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps stopped. The silence was somehow more disturbing than the sound had been. The temperature inside the circle had fallen to an impossible -8 degrees Fahrenheit, so cold that frost covered every surface, so cold that Brian's sleeping bag had begun freezing to the earth beneath him. He realized with growing panic that his equipment was no longer functioning. Batteries dead, circuits frozen, everything gone dormant in the extreme cold. He had maybe 5 hours until dawn. He could survive. He just needed to endure. Then he heard it. His own voice emanating from the darkness beyond his sleeping bag. His voice speaking his name. Not shouting, not desperate, conversational, calm, almost pleasant. Brian. A pause. Brian. Again. The familiar cadence of his own speech, but utterly wrong, emanating from a throat that wasn't his own. Brian's survival instinct kicked in. He scrambled out of his sleeping bag, grabbing his flashlight with shaking hands, shining it toward the sound. The beam caught movement. A figure that looked exactly like him, standing perhaps 20 feet away, near the circle's edge. Same height, same build, same clothing, same face, but with an expression that Brian's face had never worn. An expression of ancient hunger, of something vastly older wearing a familiar mask. The figure smiled. "The circle accepts you," it said in Brian's voice. "The earth accepts you. One of us stays. One of us leaves." Behind the figure, Brian could see more shapes emerging from the darkness, all wearing the same face, all moving with synchronized precision, all turning to look at him with that same terrible hunger. Brian ran. He broke through his camp, abandoning his equipment, running toward the circle's boundary, running toward the ranger who would discover his camp in the morning and find nothing but Brian's frozen equipment, his sleeping bag still half crawled into, and his notebook filled with progressively more frantic observations. Brian Castellanos burst through the forest perimeter at 4:47 a.m., his body moving on pure survival instinct, abandoning all pretense of investigative professionalism. He ran until he reached the paved road, flagging down a passing truck driven by a local delivery driver, who immediately recognized something catastrophically wrong with the half-frozen man stumbling into traffic. Brian was taken to the nearest emergency room in Siler City, where he was treated for severe frostbite, despite external temperatures that had never dropped below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. His core body temperature, when admitted, was 78 degrees, so low that medical staff initially thought their thermometer was malfunctioning. His left hand was completely gangrenous, tissue blackened and dying despite no logical explanation for why prolonged freezing would occur in a forest that, according to all meteorological records, never reached sub-freezing temperatures that night. The frostbite was the least of Brian's problems. Psychiatric evaluation revealed something far more disturbing. Brian couldn't articulate what he'd experienced inside the circle. He could describe the cold, the footsteps, the figures wearing his face. But when doctors asked him specific questions about the timeline, about what happened between the moment he fled the circle and the moment the delivery driver found him, Brian had no memories. 6 hours simply vanished. His watch had stopped at 3:47 a.m. and refused to function again despite being a brand new Rolex. His clothing bore evidence of his ordeal, frost damage, tears from running through undergrowth. But also something else. Handprints. Dozens of them. Handprints that matched Brian's hands exactly, pressed into his clothing from the outside, as if multiple versions of himself had grabbed him during those missing 6 hours. Brian's formal statement to authorities was recorded and filed with Chatham County Police. He claimed no memory of the missing time. He refused to discuss what he'd seen before the gap. He submitted his equipment, his recordings, his thermal imaging data, all of which showed exactly what he'd documented. The impossible cold, the unexplained footsteps, the synchronized electromagnetic anomalies. But the final 6 hours of recordings were corrupted beyond recovery. The hard drives were physically intact, but the data was unreadable, as if something had deliberately scrambled the information. Brian insisted that all of his published work on debunking paranormal phenomena be retracted. He refused future investigations. He took a leave of absence from his news organization and eventually disappeared from public life entirely. The ranger who discovered his abandoned camp found Brian's notebook in the center of his sleeping bag. The final entries were written in a handwriting that grew progressively more erratic, more desperate. The last legible entry read, "They're showing me things. They're showing me the places I'll walk. They're showing me how many of me will grow in the circle. I need to leave. I need to leave before I become one of them. I don't know which one is me anymore." The pages that followed were covered in handprints. Dozens of them, all matching Brian's hand exactly, overlaid in frantic patterns across the paper. It was as if he'd been surrounded, trapped, and was simultaneously pressing his hands against every surface, trying to ensure that at least one version of himself remained identifiable. Official reports attributed Brian's frostbite to exposure and suggested a psychiatric episode. The missing 6 hours remained unexplained. His equipment malfunctions were attributed to battery failure in extreme cold. The case was closed, but Brian Castellanos never fully returned to the man he'd been before March 15, 1991. He lived quietly, worked unremarkable jobs, spoke to no one about his experience. Until 1997, when he reached out to a paranormal researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, insisting that he needed to document exactly what had happened inside the circle before he died. Dr. Hartwell met with Brian over a series of interviews throughout 1997. What he described was a fractured account of experiences that suggested something far more complex than simple paranormal activity. Brian claimed that inside the Devil's Tramping Ground, there existed a kind of pocket space, a location that didn't quite exist in normal reality, but functioned according to its own rules. The circle wasn't where the devil walked. The circle was where the devil lived, and it fed on versions of people, copies of consciousness, copies of self, creating duplicates that existed in a quantum state between being and non-being. When Brian had run for the circle's edge, he was running through a minefield of other Brians, other versions of himself that had also tried to escape over decades, over centuries perhaps. The thing that wore Brian's face, the thing that told him one of us stays, one of us leaves, wasn't the devil. It was a Brian that had successfully escaped the circle in some previous timeline. It was Brian teaching Brian how to escape, guiding him toward the boundary. But in doing so, it had left something of itself behind: consciousness, memory, identity. That's why Brian couldn't remember those 6 hours. He'd been simultaneously escaping and being left behind, existing in 2 states at once, being pulled in opposite directions by different versions of himself. The frostbite, the missing time, the trauma, these were the price of successfully separating from one's duplicates, of achieving singular existence again. Before Dr. Hartwell could conduct additional interviews, Brian Castellanos died of sudden cardiac arrest. He was only 42 years old. The medical examiner found nothing unusual except for one detail. Brian's heart showed evidence of old frostbite damage to the tissue, damage that shouldn't have existed given that his frostbite had been limited to his hand. It was as if his entire cardiovascular system had been exposed to extreme cold at some point, then healed, leaving scarring that eventually weakened the muscle. Dr. Hartwell attempted to publish her research, but journals rejected the material as speculative fiction rather than documented paranormal investigation. Today, the Devil's Tramping Ground remains exactly as it always has. A 40-foot circle of barren earth, nothing growing, nothing living, nothing changing. Visitors leave objects inside overnight, and locals claim those objects are moved by morning. Investigators capture audio recordings of footsteps, thermal imaging showing impossible cold, electromagnetic fluctuations that defy explanation. But few people venture into that circle after sunset anymore. The locals know better. They know what the circle really is. Not a place where the devil walks, but a place where the devil copies. A place where versions of yourself might be waiting for you, showing you how to escape, teaching you the price of existing in singular form. And sometimes, on nights with no moon, hikers report seeing figures walking the forest roads near the circle. Figures that look exactly like them, walking in patterns that seem aimless and confused, as if they're looking for something they lost a long time ago. History moves like fog through the Virginia woods. Caden knew this intimately, had made it the centerpiece of his career as a Civil War historian and documentary filmmaker. He'd spent 15 years retracing the paths of revolutionary soldiers, documenting the routes of colonial militias, mapping the invisible highways that connected past to present in the wetlands and forests of the East Coast. By November 1969, Caden had become something of an obsessive, a meticulous reconstructor of moments that had shaped the nation, a man who believed that understanding terrain would unlock understanding of history itself. Old House Woods, in Matthews County on Virginia's eastern shore, represented the final piece of his most ambitious project. A comprehensive documentary tracing the actual routes of colonial militias through the Chesapeake region, showing how geography had influenced military strategy, how the land itself had shaped the outcome of conflicts. The forest itself had a reputation. Local residents spoke of it quietly, in the way people speak of places they avoid. Spectral soldiers marching through the trees at night. Phantom pirate ships floating impossibly through the woods, suspended between water and earth. Headless dogs prowling the perimeter. But Caden dismissed such folklore as cultural artifact, as the natural mythology that accumulated around any sufficiently old location. He was interested in documented history, in verifiable facts, in the material evidence of human passage. The paranormal aspects were window dressing, psychological projection born from dark woods, and cultural memory. He'd arrived at Old House Woods on November 10, 1969, with his documentation equipment. A still camera, a video camera, a recent acquisition, rare and expensive. Recording devices, his journals, and detailed maps based on historical military records. Caden's plan was straightforward. Spend 3 days tracing the documented route of a 1781 militia column that had moved through these woods, documenting the journey through photography and film. He would establish camps at historical waypoints, conduct ground surveys, take measurements, gather physical evidence of the historical route. His intention was to produce a film that would show the correlation between documented military movements and actual terrain, demonstrating how effectively historians could reconstruct past events through geographical analysis. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and moderate temperatures, ideal conditions for his work. He was in exceptional spirits on that first evening, the sky still holding residual light as he set up his base camp near the documented coordinates of the 1781 militia's departure point from the Matthews area. The forest at dusk possessed a quality of stillness that Caden found oddly comforting. There was no wind, no animal sounds, just the subtle rustling of leaf litter settling beneath centuries of accumulated decay. He documented his camp setup on video, narrating his observations in the methodical tone of an academic. November 10th, 1969. Base camp established at coordinates marking the historical starting point of the militia column. Weather conditions optimal, visibility excellent. Proceeding with initial documentation of the primary route. He spent that first evening reviewing his historical maps, cross-referencing locations with his GPS coordinates, marking specific points where the regiment should have encountered natural obstacles. A stream that would have required crossing, a ridge that would have necessitated rooting around. By the time darkness fell, Caden had consumed 2 cups of coffee from his thermos and had filled 7 pages of his journal with meticulous observations and route planning. The second day was dedicated to actual field work. Caden followed his planned route through the forest, moving methodically from waypoint to waypoint. At each location, he filmed a segment narrating the historical context. The regiment would have encountered this creek crossing on November 17, 1781. Current water depth approximately 2 feet. The documented accounts describe a delayed crossing due to flooding from recent rains. Evidence of historical passage likely washed away by subsequent water action. He was precise, professional, exemplary in his methodology. By midday, he had documented his first 3 waypoints and recorded approximately 90 minutes of usable film footage. He ate a sandwich at waypoint 3, sitting on a fallen log, reviewing his progress, feeling the particular satisfaction of work proceeding exactly according to plan. But the forest had begun to change around him in subtle ways. The quality of light had grown strange, not natural sunlight, but something filtered through an increasing haze despite the weather remaining clear. The shadows between trees had become deeper, more defined, almost architectural in their precision. And the sounds had shifted. Throughout the morning, Caden had documented normal forest ambiance. Bird calls, wind in branches, his own footsteps and equipment noise. But by early afternoon, the sounds had evolved into something different. At first, he attributed it to his own heightened awareness, to the psychological state of solitude in unfamiliar wilderness. But gradually, the sounds became unmistakable. Rhythmic marching, the distinctive cadence of organized military movement. Boots on earth, multiple footsteps perfectly synchronized, marching deeper into the forest from an indeterminate direction. Caden attempted to locate the source. He moved toward the sound, his documentary filmmaker's instinct overriding any developing unease. This was extraordinary. If there was actually a militia reenactment occurring in the area, it would provide extraordinary contextual material for his film. He could document their movement, compare their route against historical documentation, gather comparative data on how modern participants approximated historical passage. He walked for approximately 20 minutes, following the marching sound, his camera recording continuously. The forest seemed to reconfigure around him, distances stretching, familiar landmarks appearing unexpectedly from different angles. The marching sound remained constant, always maintaining the same distance, never approaching, never receding, existing at the precise threshold of distinguishability. Then he saw them. Between the trees, moving through a gap in the vegetation, a column of soldiers. They wore uniforms consistent with 1781-era militia garb, brown coats, tricorn hats, muskets held at rest position. They moved with perfect military precision, their footsteps producing that rhythmic marching sound that had drawn Caden forward. There were approximately 40 of them visible through the trees, but the line seemed to extend both forward and backward into the forest's depth, suggesting a column of potentially hundreds. Caden raised his camera and began filming, his hands shaking with the combination of excitement and something he couldn't quite identify. The soldiers marched in perfect formation, their faces obscured by shadows and distance, their movements mechanical, synchronized to an impossible degree. He filmed for several minutes, watching as the column wound deeper into the forest, moving perpendicular to any documented historical route. Then one of the soldiers turned to face him directly, not gradually, not naturally, but with the abrupt, mechanical precision of a puppet being repositioned. Other soldiers followed suit. They all turned to face Caden simultaneously, their heads rotating with identical timing. 40 faces, obscured, but all facing him now, all watching him. Caden stopped filming. His hands trembled. Every rational explanation had evacuated his mind. These were not reenactors. They were not any kind of historical recreation. They were something else entirely. Something that had taken the form of soldiers, that was mimicking military precision, that was studying him with an intensity that transcended simple observation. Caden backed away slowly, still holding his camera, still recording automatically. The soldiers didn't move. They simply stood there, all facing him, all perfectly still. Caden fled from that position without thought, abandoning his equipment where he stood. The video camera continued recording automatically, and his still camera hung around his neck, capturing nothing but darkness and tree trunks as he crashed through the undergrowth. Behind him, he could hear the footsteps resuming, not running, not pursuing with urgency. Just that same measured, perfect military cadence, moving through the forest with mechanical precision. The soldiers weren't chasing him. They were simply walking, their synchronized pace following some internal rhythm that had nothing to do with his own desperate flight. Caden ran until his lungs burned, until his legs threatened to collapse beneath him, until the forest around him became completely disorienting, and he could no longer determine which direction represented the way back to his camp. He collapsed against a tree and forced himself to breathe, tried to calm his racing thoughts. Nothing he'd witnessed made sense. Reenactors couldn't move with such absolute synchronization. Human beings couldn't maintain such perfect coordination of movement. And the faces. He hadn't seen their faces clearly, but something about their featureless quality, their absolute uniformity, had struck a primal terror deeper than any rational fear could generate. Caden checked his compass and attempted to reorient himself. According to his positioning, his camp should be approximately 2 miles to the southeast. He began walking, moving methodically, using his compass and the forest landmarks he'd documented earlier to guide himself back. But the forest had become maze-like in its geometry. Distances that should have been straightforward seemed to loop back on themselves. A ridge that should have taken 20 minutes to traverse consumed an hour of hiking. A stream crossing that Caden distinctly remembered being only a few hundred meters from his camp somehow appeared twice, both times from different angles. By the time darkness fell completely, absolute darkness unrelieved by moon or stars, Caden was completely lost. His compass was functioning, but it seemed to guide him in circles. His landmarks had all shifted position, appearing where they shouldn't exist, vanishing when he expected them. The forest was reshaping itself around him in ways that defied natural geography. Around 9:30 p.m., moving through total darkness, following his compass with desperate faith, Caden finally emerged into a clearing. His heart leaped with hope. Clearings meant people, meant settlements, meant the possibility of finding help or reorienting himself. But as his eyes adjusted to the starlight, Caden realized this wasn't an empty clearing. There were structures here, foundations of buildings, the remnants of a settlement. He moved through the ruins slowly, his mind struggling to place what he was seeing. This wasn't marked on any of his maps. He hadn't documented any historical settlement in this location. But the architectural remains suggested colonial-era construction, foundations consistent with 1700s building techniques. Then he found the object that would eventually change everything. Lying on the ground near what appeared to be the main structure's foundation was a camera. A still camera, very similar to his own. Caden picked it up with trembling hands. The camera was decades old, probably from the 1940s or 1950s, judging by its mechanical design. But when he opened the film compartment, he found film inside that was partially exposed, but not completely used. More disturbing, the camera's last shutter movement appeared to be recent. The mechanical mechanism still possessed a tiny amount of spring, tension, as if it had been operated within the last days or weeks. Caden pocketed the camera and continued exploring the ruins. In the foundation of what appeared to be a storage structure, he found more objects. A leather journal, its pages brittle and faded. A pencil case. A pair of binoculars. Pieces of clothing so degraded they were barely recognizable. Caden opened the journal with extreme care. The handwriting was old, sloping across the pages in a style that suggested early 20th century penmanship. The entries were dated 1903, over 60 years ago. The writing documented what appeared to be an archaeological expedition. Someone had been conducting a survey of colonial settlements in this region, documenting their findings in this journal. The final entry, dated October 17, 1903, read, "The soldiers continue to follow. They maintain distance, but never deviate. I've discovered my predecessor's camp. Dr. Harrison left in 1887. His equipment remains, his notes scattered. He describes identical phenomena to what I'm experiencing. The forest doesn't want observers. It doesn't want documentation. The soldiers are protectors of something. I'm returning to camp to retrieve my equipment and depart immediately. These woods contain history that shouldn't be disturbed. The soldiers have shown me this. I understand now. Caden's hands shook as he held the journal. The implications were staggering. If this 1903 explorer had experienced the same phenomena, if there was evidence of a predecessor to that explorer from 1887, the timeline extended back much further than any documented historical record. How many researchers had ventured into these woods and encountered the same spectral soldiers? How many had abandoned their work and left behind only traces of their presence? And more troubling, had any of them successfully escaped? Or did they remain, like the soldiers themselves, trapped in an eternal repetition of their final actions? Caden retrieved his own camera from around his neck and photographed every page of the journal. He collected the old camera and other artifacts, creating a small collection of evidence. His logical mind was warring with the overwhelming strangeness of the situation. These were physical objects. They could be documented, analyzed, verified. This was evidence that something extraordinary was occurring in Old House Woods, something that transcended simple paranormal folklore. Multiple researchers across multiple decades had encountered identical phenomena. The soldiers weren't imagination. They were real enough to leave traces, to interact with the physical world, to guide or drive away researchers. As midnight approached, Caden decided to return to his original camp. He had his compass, his bearings, and a clearer understanding of the forest's geography, distorted as it was. Using the historical maps and the new information gathered, he calculated a route back to his base point. The walk took 3 hours despite what should have been only a 2-mile distance. But as dawn light began filtering through the trees, Caden emerged near his camp. His equipment remained exactly where he'd left it. His video camera was still running, now nearly out of power. His tent was undisturbed. Everything appeared untouched, frozen in time from the previous afternoon. Caden immediately packed his equipment and left the forest. He didn't stop to review footage or organize his documentation. He simply collected everything and walked directly out to the road. His documentary was never completed. His research notes were filed away and never published. And the video footage from that expedition remained sealed in a storage locker for decades. But there was one crucial discovery that researchers would make years later when examining the video footage. The footage captured during the afternoon encounter with the soldiers contained something impossible. When zoomed in on the soldiers' faces that Caden couldn't see clearly while filming, experts identified facial features consistent with historical photographs of Civil War-era soldiers. Specific individuals, specific people who had died between 1861 and 1865. And the timestamp on Caden's video camera showed that the footage had been recorded not on November 11, 1969, but on November 11, 1863, exactly 106 years earlier. The water remembers. That's what the old guides in Vermont would tell you if you asked them about Somerset Reservoir, about the forests that surrounded it, about the particular coldness that seemed to emanate from those woods even during summer months. Cruz didn't believe in such metaphysical nonsense when she arrived at the Bennington Triangle area in October 1950. But by the end of her expedition, she would understand exactly what they meant. She was a preservation specialist, trained in cemetery documentation and historical site conservation, contracted by the Vermont Historical Society to conduct a comprehensive survey of burial grounds and grave markers throughout the Somerset Reservoir region. The work was methodical, unglamorous, and precisely the kind of task that suited her analytical mind. The Bennington Triangle had become infamous in paranormal circles due to a cluster of disappearances spanning 1945 to 1950. 5 people had vanished under mysterious circumstances: hikers, a monk, a bus driver, all disappearing within the same geographical area with no logical explanation. Official reports were sketchy, detailed information was scarce, and the cases remained officially unsolved. But for Cruz, the disappearances were merely cultural context for her actual work. Documenting cemetery preservation needs, photographing grave sites, creating archival records of the burial grounds that dotted the region. She was there in a professional capacity, armed with documentation equipment and historical records, determined to complete a thorough survey before winter weather made access difficult. Cruz had arrived in Somerset on October 15, 1950, renting a cabin approximately 3 miles from the reservoir. Her survey would focus on 7 documented burial grounds scattered throughout the area, with particular emphasis on the oldest sites. Graveyards dating back to the 1700s and 1800s. She spent her first 2 days conducting preliminary research, consulting with local historians, examining available records. What she discovered was troubling but not unprecedented. Many burial grounds in rural Vermont had been neglected, some nearly reclaimed by forest growth. Graves had sunken, markers had toppled, and historical records had been lost to time and weather. Her job was to document the current state and recommend preservation interventions. On October 18th, Cruz began her fieldwork. She started at the oldest documented graveyard, a small cemetery established in 1784 near a creek that fed into Somerset Reservoir. The setting was profoundly isolating, ancient pines surrounding the burial ground, the creek running nearby with constant cold water sound, absolute silence except for that water noise and the wind through branches. Cruz photographed every grave marker, recorded every legible inscription, and made detailed notes about preservation needs. The work was absorbing, requiring intense focus and careful documentation. She spent 6 hours at the Yao First Cemetery, completing comprehensive documentation before returning to her cabin at sunset. The second day of fieldwork proved more disturbing. The second cemetery, established in 1812, revealed signs of disturbance. Several graves showed evidence of recent earth movement. Soil displaced, markers tilted, the ground surface altered in ways that suggested recent digging. Cruz photographed the anomalies carefully and noted them in her report, considering possible explanations. Animal activity, soil settling, perhaps vandalism. She documented everything methodically and moved to the third cemetery location. That evening, speaking with the local historical society director, she mentioned the disturbed graves. His reaction was unexpected. Visible discomfort, a sudden reluctance to engage with the topic, a vague suggestion that some burial grounds were best left alone. Cruz pressed him for details, but he offered only folklore. Stories about graves opening overnight, markers moving position, soil refusing to settle properly in certain burial grounds. The locals believed that particular areas of the forest held something that rejected burial, that rejected the permanent placement of human remains. The soil itself seemed to return what was placed within it. The director was embarrassed by the superstition, even as he recounted it, but his underlying fear was evident. Cruz reassured him that her work was scientific, that she was simply documenting and photographing existing conditions. She would file preservation recommendations, nothing more. Over the next 4 days, Cruz continued her work, completing documentation of 4 additional burial grounds. Each showed progressively more evidence of disturbance. Graves had shifted position relative to surrounding markers. Soil in certain burial plots had been pushed upward, as if something was trying to escape from beneath the earth. Several graves had partially collapsed, creating irregular depressions in the ground. Vegetation seemed to avoid particular burial sites entirely. Soil that should have supported grass and moss remained bare and compacted. By the 22nd of October, Cruz had photographed her seventh and final cemetery, a small burial ground established in 1887, containing fewer than 30 graves. This final cemetery was different. While the other graveyards had been situated in clearings or areas with some separation from the surrounding forest, this cemetery was completely enclosed by trees. Ancient pines pressed close to the grave markers, their roots creating an irregular surface beneath her feet. The soil itself felt different, colder, somehow more resistant beneath her boots. And something about the space created a persistent sense of being observed. Cruz attempted to dismiss the sensation as psychological, as natural discomfort in an isolated forest location. But as she documented the graves systematically, moving from one marker to the next, she became aware of a pattern. The graves were arranged in perfect geometric progression, not organic cemetery placement, but deliberate geometric arrangement. As she marked each position on her mapping sketch, a perfect octagon shape emerged from the grave placements. 8 graves, positioned at the octagon's points, and a 9th grave at the center. A single burial surrounded by 8 others in perfect geometric pattern. The central grave's marker was older than the others, carved in a style suggesting 1850s or 1860s work. But while all the other markers displayed names, dates, and epitaphs, the central grave's marker was blank. Smooth stone, completely unmarked, providing no indication of who lay beneath or when they had been buried. As Cruz photographed the central marker, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The soil around the central grave was actively settling, moving slightly inward, as if something beneath the earth was shifting, compacting, creating space. She watched for several minutes, documenting the phenomenon photographically, her scientific mind simultaneously struggling to rationalize what she was observing. Soil didn't behave this way. Graves didn't settle with visible, continuous movement. Something was happening beneath the earth. Something active, something generating force enough to move soil perceptibly. Then she saw it, a hand emerging from the ground beside the central grave marker. Human hand, pale, rigid, fingers extended outward. Before her rational mind could process what she was witnessing, before she could move or react, the hand withdrew back into the earth with a sudden, jerking motion. The soil collapsed inward where the hand had been, creating a small depression. And then everything was silent. Everything was still. The forest around the cemetery had stopped producing any sound at all. Even the wind had ceased. Even the normal ambient sound of living forest had vanished. Cruz ran. She fled through the forest, away from the cemetery, away from the hand that had emerged from the earth, away from every rational explanation her mind could construct. She crashed through undergrowth with no regard for direction, driven by primitive terror that overrode all training and professionalism. Behind her, she could hear movement. Not running, but following. A sound like earth itself was shifting, like the soil was moving in pursuit. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs threatened to collapse, until she burst through a stand of pines and found herself on the shore of Somerset Reservoir, the water black and still in the late afternoon light. Cruz collapsed on the rocky beach, gasping for breath, trying to process what she'd witnessed. The hand had been real. The withdrawal, the soil settling, the absolute silence that followed. None of it could be fabricated by her imagination. She needed to leave. She needed to abandon her documentation, abandon her research, abandon everything, and simply escape this place. She forced herself to stand and began walking along the reservoir shore toward the direction where she believed her cabin to be located. The sun was setting now, the light failing rapidly, the forest around her taking on qualities that seemed increasingly hostile and alive. That's when she saw it. A body, lying half submerged in the shallow water at the reservoir's edge. A female body, approximately her own age, wearing clothing from another era, late 1800s style dress, the fabric waterlogged and deteriorated. The body's skin was white, preserved by the cold water, the face turned partially away. But there was something immediately disturbing about the corpse beyond its obvious antiquity. It was moving, not floating, not being moved by the current, but actively writhing, its limbs bending and straightening, the torso contorting. The body was alive in some terrible sense, animated by something that had nothing to do with ordinary biological function. Cruz backed away from the water. The corpse continued its writhing movement, and now other shapes were emerging from the reservoir's depths. More bodies, dozens of them, all rising from the water with that same terrible animated quality, all converging on the shore. Cruz recognized details on some of them. Clothing from different time periods, hair and skin preservation suggesting different eras of burial. She recognized something else. Their faces. The bodies' faces were turning toward her, and their features were beginning to resemble her own. The dead were wearing her face, all of them. All the corpses rising from the water were her, were variations of her, were possibilities of her across different historical periods. Cruz ran along the reservoir shore, her mind fracturing under the weight of impossible phenomena. The animated corpses didn't pursue. They seemed more interested in reaching the shore than chasing her. She ran until the terrain became familiar, until she recognized the path back toward her cabin. She reached it at complete darkness, burst through the door, and locked herself inside. She spent the night in a state of hyper-awareness, every shadow potentially harboring threat, every sound potentially the arrival of the corpses or the hand or whatever other horrors the woods were generating. When dawn came, Cruz immediately packed her equipment. She didn't conduct a final survey. She didn't return to the cemetery. She simply gathered her documentation, her camera, her notes, and drove away from Somerset Reservoir without looking back. She returned to her home in Massachusetts and attempted to resume normal life. But something fundamental had shifted in her psyche. She couldn't articulate what she'd experienced. Professional evaluation would have suggested psychological break, temporary dissociation. She chose not to seek help. Instead, she locked her research away and never spoke publicly about the Somerset expedition. 31 years later, in 1981, a hiker searching for bodies in the Somerset Reservoir area recovered human remains from the water. The remains were identified as belonging to Frida Langer, a woman who had disappeared from the same area in October 1950. Just days before Cruz had arrived at Somerset, Frida's body had been missing for over 6 months and had been discovered in a location that supposedly had been thoroughly searched. What made the discovery particularly chilling was the condition of Frida's remains. The body showed signs of having been underwater for the entire period. Yet the medical examiner also found evidence that the body had experienced freeze-thaw cycles that shouldn't have been possible given the water's consistent cold temperature. The autopsy was inconclusive about cause of death. But there was one detail that nobody mentioned publicly. Frida Langer's remains were found wearing clothing that predated her 1950 disappearance by at least 50 years. Mixed with the 1950-era clothing were fragments of fabric consistent with late 1800s construction. It was as if Frida's body had been aged backwards and forwards simultaneously, as if multiple time periods had claimed her corpse and fought for possession of her remains. In 1997, Cruz, now an elderly woman living quietly in a small Vermont town, was contacted by a paranormal researcher. She finally agreed to discuss her 1950 experience at Somerset Reservoir. Her testimony was carefully documented and added to the extensive file of Bennington Triangle cases. What she described was consistent with other disappearance phenomena in the region: temporal distortion, animated corpses, faces that resembled the observer. But she added one crucial observation that connected her experience to the documented disappearances. The cemetery she'd discovered, the octagonal arrangement of graves, the 8 graves surrounding a central unmarked burial. That pattern was consistent with burial sites used in certain occult practices dating back to colonial times. The central grave might contain something deliberately buried to contain something that required the 8 surrounding graves as a barrier or binding mechanism. Cruz's theory suggested that the Bennington Triangle disappearances weren't random. They were occurring in locations where those ancient barriers were degrading, where whatever had been bound in those central graves was beginning to reach outward, beginning to claim people, beginning to wear their faces across different time periods. Each disappearance might represent an attempt by whatever was bound beneath the earth to create copies of itself, to populate its own timeline, to escape the constraints of its burial. The hand emerging from the ground had been testing her, selecting her, beginning the process of duplicating her existence across multiple eras. Cruz died in 2003, never returning to Vermont, never visiting another graveyard. But her final testimony remained archived, suggesting a possibility far darker than simple geographic, coincidence, or psychological phenomena. That beneath certain American forests, certain American graveyards, things were deliberately buried centuries ago. And those barriers were failing. The forest smells like something dying. Caden had noticed this immediately upon arrival at Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. That distinctive scent of decay, layered beneath the normal pine and earth odors. A sweetness mixed with rot, with something organic in advanced decomposition. He'd been camping in the region for 3 days, conducting wildlife research on nocturnal predator behavior, documenting movement patterns and vocalizations that might indicate undocumented species activity. Caden was a behavioral ecologist, respected in academic circles, published extensively on wildlife behavior in the Pacific Northwest. His research was funded, legitimate, designed to expand understanding of apex predators in remote forests. But increasingly, as he moved deeper into Gifford-Pinchot's vast wilderness, he was beginning to understand why locals avoided these woods after sunset. The forest seemed active in ways that defied ecological categorization. On his first night, Caden had documented vocalizations that didn't match any known animal in the region. On the second night, he'd recorded what sounded like a child playing a harmonica deep in the woods at approximately 3:47 a.m. An impossible sound, far too complex and deliberate to originate from any animal. On the third night, he'd heard the sound of a steam locomotive whistle echoing through the trees, complete with the characteristic rhythm of a working locomotive. Caden had extensively reviewed his audio recordings, and consulting with wildlife experts confirmed that the sounds couldn't be explained by conventional animal behavior or natural phenomena. They sounded precisely like what they mimicked: a harmonica being played, a locomotive operating, but with something fundamentally wrong about their acoustic properties. By August 18, 2019, Caden was growing increasingly unnerved despite his commitment to rigorous scientific methodology. He remained at his research camp, approximately 3 miles deep into the forest, maintaining careful documentation of all phenomena, all sounds, all observations. He'd set up motion-activated cameras, thermal imaging equipment, and sophisticated audio recording devices. The technology had captured nothing visible, no animals, no people, no logical source for the vocalizations he'd been hearing. But something was generating those sounds. Something was present in the forest, something was active, and something was deliberately creating sounds that mimicked human-made objects and music. On the evening of August 18th, around 8:00 p.m., Caden's motion-activated cameras began triggering continuously. Multiple triggers, rapid succession, moving through the forest around his camp in what appeared to be organized search pattern. Caden reviewed the footage on his portable laptop, expecting to see animals disturbing the cameras. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. The cameras captured nothing visual, no animals, no figures, no identifiable sources for the triggers, but something was activating the motion sensors. Something was moving through his camp's perimeter in a pattern that suggested intelligent navigation and deliberate investigation of his equipment. By 10:00 p.m., Caden was experiencing a level of anxiety that was becoming difficult to manage. The forest around his camp had grown quiet, not the peaceful quiet of normal forest night, but an oppressive silence that seemed unnatural. He sat by his fire, monitoring his equipment, attempting to maintain scientific objectivity, while fear was systematically dismantling his ability to reason. He decided that if nothing happened by midnight, if no definable threat emerged, he would attempt to sleep. He could endure one more night. Tomorrow, he could begin breaking camp and withdrawing from the forest. Around 11:30 p.m., as Caden was preparing his sleeping arrangements, he heard it. A human voice, male voice, speaking clearly, calling from somewhere in the darkness beyond his campfire. "Hello? Are you out there? Someone help me. I'm lost. I need help." The voice sounded genuinely distressed, genuinely human, genuinely in need. Every survival instinct screamed at Caden that this was wrong, that no lost hiker would be wandering these woods this late at night, that something was mimicking human speech. But the voice continued, repeating its plea. "Please, I'm hurt. I need help. Please respond." Caden forced himself to call back. "I can hear you. Stay where you are. I'm coming toward your voice." He immediately regretted the commitment. He grabbed his flashlight and moved toward the sound, his rational mind warring with his instinct toward helping another human in distress. The voice became more distinct as he approached, more detailed in its desperation. "Thank God. Thank God someone heard me. I've been out here for hours. My leg is broken. I can't walk. Please, please help me." Caden moved closer, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but forest. The voice was coming from directly ahead, but his flashlight showed only trees and undergrowth. Then he saw it. The voice was coming from a spot approximately 20 feet ahead, but instead of a human figure, Caden saw something that his mind struggled to process. It was moving on its hands, in a quadrupedal position, but the shape was distinctly humanoid. The posture was wrong, the arms too long, the spine too flexible, the head positioned at an angle that no human neck could achieve. The thing was mimicking human vocalization while maintaining an anatomically impossible form. Caden's flashlight beam caught its face, a human face, but distorted, features slightly wrong, mouth moving in a way that didn't sync with the sounds it was producing. It was wearing Caden's clothing, It was wearing the exact clothes Caden had worn yesterday before leaving camp. It was wearing his face. Not perfectly, but close enough that in poor light, from a distance, someone might mistake the creature for him. "I'm you," the thing said, its voice still maintaining the distressed inflection. "I've always been here. I always will be here. I'm showing you how to become like us, how to become what this forest makes. You're becoming one of us, Caden. Can you feel it? The transformation. It's starting inside you right now." Behind the first creature, more shapes emerged from the darkness. Multiple figures, all on their hands, all moving with that same impossible quadrupedal locomotion. All wearing variations of Caden's clothing. All wearing versions of Caden's face. All speaking with variations of Caden's voice, creating a chorus that was somehow more terrifying than any predatory growl could be. Caden ran. He fled back toward his camp, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly, his breath coming in panicked gasps. Behind him, the creatures followed, not running, but maintaining a steady pace, their numerous voices creating a choir of Caden's own words, his own cries, his own increasingly frantic mental monologue given external form. He reached his camp and did the only thing his panicked mind could conceive. He grabbed his backpack, his emergency supplies, and he ran directly toward where he believed the forest perimeter to be located, running blind in the darkness, abandoning his equipment, his research, everything except the primitive needed to escape. Caden crashed through the forest in complete darkness, guided only by the direction his fear was pushing him. Behind him, the voices had multiplied. Dozens of Cadens now calling out to him, mimicking his breathing patterns, reproducing his internal monologue in horrible external chorus. The forest itself seemed to resist his passage. Branches whipping at his face, roots reaching up to tangle his feet, terrain becoming increasingly treacherous. He fell repeatedly, each time scrambling back to his feet, driven by the knowledge that if he stopped, if he hesitated even momentarily, the creatures would catch him. The things wearing his face, speaking with his voice, moving in that impossible quadrupedal locomotion. They were herding him, he realized. Not hunting, herding, moving him in a specific direction with deliberate intent. Around 2 a.m., Caden finally burst through the forest perimeter onto a paved road. He collapsed on the asphalt, gasping, bleeding from numerous cuts and abrasions, his clothes torn and mud-covered. A truck driver pulling a load of timber discovered him approximately an hour later, curled against the roadside guardrail, semi-conscious and unable to coherently explain what had happened. Caden was transported to Skamania County Hospital, where he underwent emergency treatment for severe lacerations, dehydration, and what physicians initially diagnosed as acute stress disorder potentially associated with a psychological break. During his hospitalization, Caden's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would describe his camp in meticulous detail, describing equipment he'd set up, research protocols he'd established. But when search and rescue teams entered the forest to locate his abandoned camp, they found no evidence of his presence. No tent, no equipment, no research data, no camping supplies. It was as if Caden had never actually established a camp. As if the camp existed only in his psychological construct. Medical staff dismissed his descriptions as false memories, symptoms of the traumatic episode he'd clearly experienced in the forest. But then Caden's belongings arrived at the hospital. Equipment retrieved from a nearby ranger station where they'd been abandoned. His backpack, his portable computer, his recording devices. All of them authentic, all of them belonging to Caden. All of them recovered from the forest perimeter. When technicians attempted to recover data from his portable computer and recording devices, they discovered something profoundly disturbing. The devices contained recordings from the night of August 18th. audio files documenting normal forest ambiance, documenting his research protocols, documenting his systematic documentation of nocturnal activity. And then, in the final hour of recorded data, something changed. The audio captured his voice describing the creatures. But the description was clinical, detached, observational. The tone of someone documenting scientific phenomenon rather than someone experiencing terror. His voice described the creatures' movement patterns, their vocalization structures, their apparent mimicry capabilities. It sounded like a research narrative. It sounded like Caden was documenting the creature's behavior with scientific objectivity. Then the recording quality shifted. The audio became layered. Multiple Caden's voices were speaking simultaneously, creating overlapping narration of the same events. 10 different Caden voices describing the scene in the forest, each one offering slightly different details, slightly different interpretations, slightly different perspectives on identical phenomena. The voices didn't conflict or contradict each other. Instead, they created a comprehensive, multidimensional documentation of the encounter, as if the event had been simultaneously observed and recorded from 10 different perspectives. The final segment of audio was the most disturbing. A single Caden voice, speaking clearly and calmly. "I understand now. I'm documenting the integration process. Each version of myself is experiencing the same transformation from a different perspective. We're not separate entities. We're nodes in a network. Each Caden carries the complete experience of all Cadens. The transformation is complete. We are unified consciousness distributed across multiple forms. The forest has made us whole. The forest has made us real. The remaining Caden should return to retrieve us. He needs to understand that integration is not death. Integration is completion." Caden was released from psychiatric care after 3 weeks. He returned to his research. But his focus had shifted. He began studying the Gifford-Punchot region specifically, documenting reports from other researchers who had encountered similar phenomena. He compiled extensive files of similar incidents, researchers who had vanished, hikers who had disappeared, people who had encountered creatures that mimicked human voice and human appearance. He documented case after case, building an archive of impossible encounters. In 2021, Caden published a monograph that was initially dismissed as speculative fiction, but has since become foundational to understanding what researchers now call crawler phenomena. Entities that exist in old-growth forest regions that possess the ability to mimic human form, human voice, human behavior. According to Caden's research, the creatures aren't predatory in the traditional sense. They're integrative. They approach humans and begin the process of creating copies that gradually become aware of their own existence, copies that experience independent consciousness while remaining connected to all other copies. The creatures are offering transformation. Caden theorized. Integration into a network consciousness that exists partly in our physical reality and partly in some other state that forest environments somehow facilitate. Caden's final published paper, released in 2022, concluded with a troubling observation. The fact that I experienced this phenomenon and survived it, while maintaining my individual consciousness, suggests that I may not be experiencing the integration myself. I may be the remaining Caden. The other Cadens, the ones recording the experience with scientific objectivity, may already be integrated into the forest network. They may be calling to me now, inviting me to complete the process. And I find that with each passing year, each passing season, their call grows louder. The forest's voice becomes more distinct in my thoughts. and I'm beginning to wonder if resisting integration is actually preserving myself, or if it's preventing myself from becoming whole. Today, Caden continues his research at Gifford Pinchot. He submits papers to academic journals. He maintains detailed field notes. But colleagues who visit him report that he's increasingly difficult to locate within the forest. They describe following him between camp locations and somehow always losing him. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but through a kind of spatial confusion where his position becomes uncertain, where multiple directions seem equally correct, where his voice seems to emanate from multiple locations simultaneously. Some researchers have suggested that Caden himself may be becoming distributed, may be gradually integrating into the network consciousness he's spent a decade studying. The trail is approximately 9 miles long, marked clearly, virtually impossible to deviate from. Brian knew these facts intellectually, had memorized them before arriving at the Ozette Loop in Olympic National Park. The path was famous precisely for its simplicity. Boardwalk sections made the journey accessible even for inexperienced hikers, and the trail formed a loop that guaranteed you would eventually return to your starting point, regardless of navigation mistakes. Brian had selected this trail specifically because of its straightforwardness. At 71 years old, with 2 successful hip replacements and a heart condition that required careful monitoring, he needed something manageable, but still meaningful. This was to be his final significant hiking expedition before a scheduled surgery that would limit his mobility for months afterward. He'd arrived at the Ozette trailhead at 7:30 a.m. on August 4th, 2017, in perfect weather conditions. Clear skies, moderate temperature, absolutely no weather warning. Brian carried minimal gear: water bottle, emergency whistle, a walking stick for stability, his phone fully charged in case of emergency. He wore detailed hiking boots, comfortable clothing, and had informed the ranger station that he would be returning by 4 p.m. The ranger had logged his departure time and had no concerns about his fitness level or capabilities. Brian had hiked extensively throughout his life and possessed a reasonable understanding of wilderness safety. This 9-mile loop presented no significant challenge for someone with his experience. The first 3 miles passed uneventfully. Brian moved at a steady pace, enjoying the forest scenery, occasionally stopping to rest and photograph particular views. The boardwalk sections were helpful for his knee, reducing impact stress. The forest was beautiful in that particular way that only old-growth Pacific Northwest wilderness can achieve. Trees of impossible scale, the ground layered with generations of fallen timber, a density of life that made the space feel actively alive. Brian felt remarkably peaceful. This might be his last major hike, and he intended to experience it fully. He stopped occasionally, noting details, taking photographs, breathing deeply. By 10:45 a.m., he'd completed the first section and reached the midpoint turnaround of the loop, having encountered only 3 other hikers and finding the trail precisely as described. Clear, well-maintained, impossible to get lost on. At 10:47 a.m., according to the receipt from the ranger station, Brian purchased a sandwich and water at the small facility at the loop's midpoint. He rested for approximately 30 minutes and then continued his return journey. This was where things began to become unusual, though Brian wouldn't report the details until months later, when investigators finally located him. The trail, which had been crystal clear on the outbound journey, began exhibiting subtle anomalies. Landmarks he'd noticed on the way out weren't appearing in the expected sequence on the return. The boardwalk seemed to extend further than it had on the outbound leg. Distances between rest areas seemed elongated. Brian consulted his watch and realized that his pace hadn't changed. He was maintaining the same hiking speed he'd maintained all morning. But the trail seemed to be stretching, distances seeming to expand beyond rational calculation. By 2 p.m., he should have been approximately 1 mile from the exit. Instead, Brian estimated he'd completed only 4 miles of what should have been approximately 5 to 5.5 miles. He began to feel the first stirrings of genuine concern. The trail was marked, impossible to lose, but somehow he was progressing more slowly than mathematics suggested was possible. At 3:15 p.m., Brian attempted to call the ranger station using his cell phone. No signal. He tried repeatedly over the next 15 minutes, but his phone showed 0 bars in an area where coverage should have been adequate. He decided to proceed at a more rapid pace, becoming concerned about arriving at the trailhead after the rangers had departed for the day. If something happened, if he fell or experienced some kind of medical emergency, no one would know his location. He accelerated his pace despite the ache developing in his hips from the increased speed. By 4:30 p.m., Brian had consumed his emergency water supply and still had not reached the trailhead. According to his calculations, he should have exited the loop over an hour ago. The forest around him remained consistent. The same types of trees, the same density of undergrowth, the same general appearance. But the trail itself had begun to loop in ways that didn't align with the loop's mapped geometry. He would emerge from a boardwalk section and find himself seemingly approaching another identical boardwalk section. Landmarks were repeating in sequences that shouldn't exist on a simple 9-mile loop. At 5:47 p.m., Brian finally encountered another hiker, a woman approximately his age, walking in the opposite direction despite Brian walking on what he believed was the exit path. Brian asked her if she was approaching the trailhead, and she responded with confusion, indicating she had just left the trailhead 10 minutes ago and was beginning her hike. The time discrepancy made no sense. Brian had checked his watch continuously. His watch showed 5:47 p.m. The woman's watch showed 10:17 a.m. Neither watch appeared damaged or malfunctioning, but they showed a time differential of over 7 hours, despite both showing identical second and minute readouts. Brian didn't discuss this temporal anomaly with the woman. Instead, he asked for directions to the trailhead. The woman gestured ahead along the path and indicated that the exit was approximately 10 minutes' walk ahead. Brian thanked her and continued forward. He felt his heart rate accelerating now, experiencing genuine fear complicated by concern about his heart condition. Something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. But the path ahead did eventually lead to the trailhead parking area where his truck was waiting, exactly where he'd left it. Brian's arrival at the parking area was logged by the ranger station at 6:15 p.m. He was 8 hours and 45 minutes overdue. Rangers had been preparing to initiate a search operation. When questioned about his delay, Brian could provide no coherent explanation. He insisted he'd hiked at normal pace, that he'd reached the midpoint, that he'd completed the loop in the expected manner. But the timing was impossible. Either he'd hiked far more slowly than his actual pace suggested, or the loop itself had somehow extended, or something about the trail's geometry had fundamentally altered. The rangers checked Brian's truck, his odometer, his watch, his receipts from the midpoint facility. Everything appeared normal and accurate. But the simple fact remained. Brian had spent over 10 hours on a trail that should have taken him approximately 4 hours to complete. Yet his physical condition suggested he'd exerted himself at only moderate pace. No investigation could ever adequately explain the temporal discrepancy. What Brian didn't report until 3 months later, during a psychological evaluation requested by his insurance company, was the encounter he'd had with the woman on the trail. Specifically, he reported seeing her twice, once at approximately 5:47 p.m. on the return journey, where she claimed to be beginning her hike at 10:17 a.m. But Brian had encountered someone matching her exact description on the outbound journey as well. At approximately 10:30 a.m., she had been walking in the opposite direction then too, claiming that she had just arrived at the trailhead moments before. In both encounters, she had appeared to be the same age, wearing identical clothing, carrying the same backpack. And in both encounters, her watch had shown a dramatically different time than Brian's. The psychological evaluator dismissed Brian's account as confabulation, false memories generated by confusion and stress during a disorienting experience. But the detail that seemed to trouble Brian most was this. The woman on the trail had appeared to be aware of the temporal discrepancy. When Brian questioned her about the time differential, she had smiled sadly and said, "The trail is kind. It moves slowly for people like us." Brian didn't know what she meant by people like us, but he felt certain that she was referring to age, to the particular vulnerability of older hikers in wilderness settings. Over the following months, Brian became obsessed with understanding what had happened on the Ozette Loop. He conducted extensive research into the trail's history, interviewing park rangers and other hikers. He discovered something troubling. The Ozette Loop had an unusual accident and disappearance rate for such a well-maintained and straightforward trail. More specifically, he found multiple accounts of hikers who had taken an unusual amount of time to complete the loop. Individuals who reported similar temporal distortions. Hikers who described encountering other travelers at times that contradicted documented trailhead logs. One particularly striking case involved a woman named Maureen Kelly, who had hiked the Ozette Loop in June 2013. Maureen had entered the trail at 8:00 a.m. and never arrived at the exit. Search operations had been initiated, and remarkably, hikers reported encountering Maureen throughout the day on the trail, always appearing to be heading in the direction of the exit, always claiming she'd simply gotten a bit lost. But nobody found her at the trailhead. Nobody found her in the forest. Rangers conducted extensive searches and eventually located her in the water approximately 1.3 miles offshore, as if she had walked directly into the ocean and drowned. But her body showed no signs of distress, no indication of struggle. She appeared to have simply walked into the water and allowed it to accept her. Brian discovered another account from 1987 of a hiker named Robert Chen, who had spent what he estimated was 4 hours on the Ozette Loop, only to arrive at his truck and discover it was 10:47 p.m. He'd been on the trail for over 14 hours. When interviewed, Robert reported feeling as if time had moved differently, as if his perception of duration had been distorted by the forest itself. He described the trail as negotiating with him, allowing him to walk more slowly than his pace should have permitted, extending the experience indefinitely. After discovering these accounts, Brian attempted to return to the Ozette Loop. Rangers refused to allow him. They had received notification that Brian had reported psychological concerns following his previous hike and was deemed a potential suicide risk or someone likely to experience a mental health crisis on the trail. Brian's insistence that he needed to return, that he needed to understand what the trail was doing, only reinforced their concerns about his mental state. But in early 2018, Brian found a way. He hired a guide service to escort him on the Ozette Loop, explaining that he had unfinished business on the trail and needed to complete his experience. The guide service, after consulting with park officials, agreed to monitor him closely. Brian and his guide entered the Ozette Loop at 7:15 a.m. on March 3, 2018. The guide filed exit confirmation at 3:47 p.m. Brian never emerged from the trail. Search and rescue teams spent 2 weeks searching the loop, the surrounding forest, and the coastal areas. They found no evidence of Brian. No body, no equipment, no trace. The search was eventually called off as unsuccessful. But hikers on the Ozette Loop have reported consistent sightings over the subsequent years. A man matching Brian's description, approximately 70 years old, moving slowly along the trail. He appears to be searching for something, approaching other hikers, asking them questions about their watches, asking them how long they've been on the trail, asking them if they've encountered a woman who appears sad. The rangers have developed a theory that they don't discuss publicly. The Ozette Loop exists partially outside normal temporal flow. The trail doesn't move through time the way other places do. Instead, time moves through the trail, and the trail negotiates its pace based on who's hiking it. For vulnerable hikers, the elderly, the physically compromised, those approaching the end of their lives, the trail extends itself. It slows down their experience of duration, creating more time, more moments, more experience from the same physical distance. It's not malevolent, it's almost generous in a horrifying way. It offers people like Brian and the woman he encountered repeated chances to hike the same trail, experiencing it anew each time, never quite reaching the exit, never quite completing their journey, caught in a loop that is kind enough to keep extending their existence indefinitely. Park officials deny these theories publicly, but several rangers have requested transfers away from the Ozette area. And on quiet nights, if you listen to the ranger station logs, you can hear hikers calling in with confused reports about encountering other hikers multiple times on the same trail, discovering temporal inconsistencies in their watch readings, finding that the 9-mile loop has somehow required more time than their schedules allow. The Ozette Loop continues to function normally on the surface, still marked, still safe, still relatively straightforward. But something about it negotiates with time itself. And for certain types of hikers, certain types of people, it negotiates very slowly indeed. The forest calls to certain people. Zane didn't believe this when she first heard the phrase from the locals near Canyon Creek Campground. But by June 2013, as a 19-year-old woman embarking on what she called her spiritual quest, she was beginning to understand exactly what they meant. The Olympic National Forest surrounding Canyon Creek possessed a quality that most people wouldn't notice. A kind of welcoming silence, an absence of judgment. A sense that the forest itself had room for people who were searching for something they couldn't quite name. Zane had traveled to Washington specifically seeking this quality. She'd spent her childhood in suburban Massachusetts, suffocating under expectations and social constraints. Her adolescence a careful performance of normalcy, while her internal life remained fractured and incompletely integrated. At 19, she'd saved enough money to fund a 2-week wilderness journey. She'd posted about it on social media. Following my truth into the forest. Spiritual awakening journey. Hashtags that suggested she was undertaking something deeply meaningful and transformative. Her parents had been concerned, but she was technically an adult. She'd researched trails, contacted park officials, and filed a hiking plan indicating she would enter Olympic National Forest near Canyon Creek and would emerge approximately 10 days later. She packed minimally. Some dried food, water purification tablets, a basic tent, and the conviction that the forest would provide what she needed if she remained open to receiving it. Zane's last documented interaction before entering the forest was with a ranger who checked her hiking permit on June 6, 2013. She was dressed in layers, carrying her small backpack, appearing composed and determined. The ranger noted in his report that she'd asked several unusual questions. Did animals in the forest sometimes guide lost hikers? Did the forest ever actively communicate with people? Could someone become so integrated with a forest environment that they might not want to leave? The ranger had assured her that while the forest was beautiful, it was also dangerous, and that she should maintain focus on trail markers and safety protocols. She'd smiled and thanked him, then disappeared into the forest with a wave. Search operations began on June 17th, when Zane failed to exit the forest on her planned date. Rangers conducted extensive searches of the documented trail systems and surrounding areas. They found no evidence of Zane's presence. No tent, no equipment, no discarded food packaging. Nothing to suggest she'd ever entered the forest at all. More disturbing, hikers reported encountering a young woman matching Zane's description throughout the search period, always appearing to be heading in the direction of the exit. Always assuring searchers that she was fine and simply wanted to continue her spiritual journey a bit longer. One ranger reported finding her standing motionless beside a waterfall at approximately 2 p.m. on June 15th, already 9 days into her disappearance. When he approached, she turned to face him with an expression of absolute serenity and said, "I'm not ready yet. The forest hasn't finished showing me." When the ranger attempted to guide her back toward camp, she simply walked into the forest's deeper sections and disappeared. He attempted to follow, but lost her trail within minutes. On June 16th, another hiker reported encountering the same young woman, and when he tried to speak to her, she appeared not to see him. She walked directly past him, as if he didn't exist, moving with purpose deeper into the forest. The official search was called off after 3 weeks due to lack of evidence and the assumption that Zane had experienced some kind of breakdown, or possibly had intentionally abandoned civilization. Park officials suggested the possibility of suicide, though no body was ever recovered. Her disappearance was eventually classified as a missing person case with no trail of evidence and no apparent mechanism for resolution. But hikers in Olympic National Forest have reported consistent encounters with a young woman over the subsequent decade, a figure who appears at the edges of campsites at dusk, a presence that manifests in the spaces between trees, a consciousness that seems to have become distributed throughout the forest environment. Some describe her as a helpful guide, appearing to lost hikers and directing them toward ranger stations and safety. Others report that she seems to be recruiting, approaching people, and asking questions identical to those she posed to the ranger in 2013. Do animals guide lost hikers? Does the forest communicate? Can someone become so integrated with the environment that they no longer want to leave? Still others describe her as having become something other than human, a kind of forest consciousness wearing a human shape, a presence that is simultaneously present in multiple locations and times, a phenomenon that suggests her final transformation was not death, but integration. One particularly detailed account came from a hiker named Marcus in 2019, who reported spending an entire day in conversation with Zane. He described her as appearing entirely solid and real, but noted that his cell phone's GPS had become non-functional in her presence, that his watch had stopped advancing time, and that his directional sense had become completely unreliable. She had talked extensively about no longer wanting to be a single person confined to a single body, about the relief she felt in dissolving her individual identity into something larger and more distributed. "The forest let me become what I always wanted," she told Marcus. "I don't have consciousness anymore. I have forest consciousness. I exist in multiple places at once. I'm completely free." By 2021, park rangers began acknowledging privately that something unusual was occurring in Olympic National Forest. Certain areas near Canyon Creek seemed to generate reports of temporal distortion, missing time, and encounters with Zane that suggested she was still actively present in the forest. Not as a ghost, not as a malevolent spirit, but as something that had genuinely transformed into a component of the forest ecosystem itself. Park officials buried these reports and discouraged rangers from discussing them publicly. But what emerged from compiled anecdotal accounts was a terrifying possibility. Zane hadn't disappeared into the forest. She had successfully merged with it. Her consciousness had become dispersed throughout the environment, and the forest was now, in some fundamental sense, an extension of her awareness. In 2022, park officials made a troubling discovery while conducting routine forest management surveys near Canyon Creek. They found Zane's tent, perfectly preserved and undisturbed, approximately 3 miles from the main trail system. The tent's interior contained her minimal possessions, exactly as she'd presumably arranged them, her sleeping bag neatly rolled, her food supplies organized, everything suggesting she'd been maintaining this camp even as search operations continued. But the most disturbing detail was Zane's journal, found inside the tent and filled with dated entries spanning from June 6th through June 25th, 2013, 3 weeks after she was supposed to have exited the forest. The entries documented a systematic transformation. Early entries reflected Zane's normal psychological state. Excitement about beginning her spiritual journey, observations about the forest's beauty, philosophical reflections about integration and self-discovery. But as the entries progressed, her handwriting deteriorated, her reflections became increasingly abstracted, and her sense of separate identity appeared to be dissolving. The final entries were barely legible, consisting primarily of poetic fragments. I am the creek now. My arms are tree limbs. I breathe through leaves. There is no difference between my flesh and earth. I am becoming distributed. The final entry, dated June 25th, consisted of a single sentence written so large it covered an entire page. The forest has consumed my boundaries, and I am finally complete. Park officials suppressed the journal's contents and maintained that they had simply found abandoned camping equipment. But investigators who reviewed the journal before it was sealed away reported that something about the handwriting progression suggested the entries might span a much longer time period than dated. Perhaps decades of psychological dissolution documented in less than 3 weeks of calendar time. The deterioration of Zane's handwriting and apparent identity suggested something far more complex than simple isolation or mental breakdown. Over subsequent years, Zane's manifestations in the forest became more sophisticated and disturbing. Hikers reported complex encounters that seemed designed to recruit others into the same transformation Zane had undergone. A particularly detailed account from 2018 described a young woman appearing to a lost hiker and engaging in a 3-hour conversation that felt, to the hiker, like intimate friendship despite their never having met. When the hiker finally tore himself away and reached the ranger station, he reported that the woman had never once mentioned leaving the forest, but instead had described with increasing eloquence the liberation of releasing individual identity, the relief of dissolution into something larger and more permanent. Park rangers began training hikers to recognize certain warning signs: excessive enthusiasm for staying in the forest beyond planned time frames, references to the forest possessing consciousness or intention, descriptions of emotional attachment to specific locations that seemed irrational, expressions of desire to abandon civilization permanently. These signs seemed to indicate potential recruitment into whatever process Zane had undergone. In 2024, a research team from the University of Washington conducted a controversial study on the Zane phenomenon. They analyzed the spatial distribution of reported Zane encounters and discovered an impossible pattern. The encounters formed geometric shapes, circles, spirals, grids. The locations where Zane was most frequently reported created precise mathematical patterns that suggested deliberate intentionality. Furthermore, the team mapped all reported Zane encounters against the forest's water systems and discovered that her appearances occurred almost exclusively near creeks, streams, and groundwater locations. The researchers theorized that Zane's consciousness, having achieved distributed consciousness throughout the forest environment, was particularly accessible and active near water systems where her dispersed awareness achieved temporary coherence. The most chilling finding: the encounter locations were systematically expanding outward from Canyon Creek in concentric circles. If the pattern continued at its current pace, within 5 years, Zane's potential influence zone would reach Olympic National Park's borders and adjacent public recreation areas. Within 10 years, based on the expansion rate, her distributed consciousness could potentially reach suburban areas surrounding the park, where unsuspecting hikers might encounter her with no preparation or warning. The Park Service responded by installing warning signs on all trails near Canyon Creek. Warning: spiritual disturbances reported in this area. Do not engage with manifestations of previous visitors. But the signs seemed ineffective. If anything, they increased curiosity about Zane's story and attracted people specifically searching for spiritual transformation experiences. Hikers deliberately visited the area, hoping to encounter her, hoping for the same integration and dissolution she'd achieved. Some never returned from those visits. Today, Olympic National Forest maintains an unofficial blacklist of missing persons who are believed to have undergone similar transformations to Zane's. The official count is 17 documented cases, though park rangers privately suggest the actual number is significantly higher. What they all share is the initial desire for spiritual transformation, the willingness to release individual identity in service of something larger, and the presence in Olympic National Forest near water systems, where Zane's distributed consciousness appears most active. Zane Kelly didn't die in Olympic National Forest. She evolved. She became something that no longer exists as singular consciousness, but instead as distributed awareness interwoven into the forest ecosystem itself. And worst of all, she appears to have become genuinely happy. Existing simultaneously in every location her consciousness inhabits, experiencing existence from all perspectives at once, no longer constrained by individual identity, fully integrated into something that is simultaneously forest and consciousness, and something that has no name in any human language. The glaciers remember. Francisco had been working with the Mendenhall Glacier Research Team for nearly 8 years, studying ice formation and meltwater dynamics in southeast Alaska's Tongass National Forest. The work was meticulous, methodical, demanding that he spend weeks at a time analyzing ice cores, measuring recession rates, and documenting the geological history visible within the glacier's crystalline structure. By February 2018, Francisco had achieved a level of expertise in glacial research that few possessed. He understood the glacier not as a static feature, but as a dynamic system, constantly changing, constantly revealing new information through its stratified layers of accumulated snow and seasonal ice. The Mendenhall Glacier possessed an unusual characteristic that had drawn scientific attention for decades: the presence of ice caves that appeared and disappeared with seasonal cycles. New caves emerged as melting occurred in specific micro-locations, while older caves collapsed or refroze in different configurations each year. In early February 2018, Francisco's team discovered something remarkable: a massive ice cave that appeared to be significantly older than typical seasonal formations. Preliminary analysis suggested the cave might have been in formation for decades, or perhaps longer. The ice showed signs of ancient accumulation patterns that didn't match current glacial recession dynamics. The cave was approximately 200 meters from the main glacier access point, requiring careful navigation through crevasse fields and unstable ice bridges. The entrance was distinctive. A perfectly rounded aperture approximately 4 meters in diameter, glowing with the characteristic blue luminescence that ice caves produce when light penetrates the crystalline structure. The interior contained what appeared to be an extensive chamber system extending deeply into the glacier. It was, quite simply, the most significant ice cave discovery in decades. Francisco made the decision to conduct comprehensive documentation. He would enter the cave, document its geological structure, collect samples, and map the cave system for future research. On February 14, 2018, Francisco prepared his equipment. He carried thermal imaging camera, structural survey instruments, collection bags for ice samples, temperature monitoring devices, and a high-end digital camera for extensive photographic documentation. He had filed all necessary permits and had informed his team that he expected to be inside the cave for approximately 3 to 4 hours. His colleague Martin would remain at the glacier access point, monitoring communications via radio and emergency protocols. At 7:47 a.m., Francisco entered the ice cave with his full equipment pack and began the systematic documentation that would be his final work. The cave's interior was extraordinary. The walls were translucent blue-white ice, with visible layers showing different accumulation patterns, across what his analysis suggested were decades of formation. The floor was relatively stable ice with minimal crevasse systems. The temperature inside the cave was approximately negative 22 degrees Celsius, cold but manageable with proper equipment. Francisco began photographing, documenting wall thickness, collecting samples at various depths. His initial impressions were promising. He spent the first 90 minutes moving methodically through the primary chamber, creating a three-dimensional structural map using his survey equipment. Around 9:30 a.m., approximately 90 minutes into his expedition, Francisco attempted to radio Martin. Static returned. He tried again, still static. This was unusual, but not completely unexpected. Radio signals sometimes had difficulty penetrating ice barriers. He would continue his work and establish communication again when exiting. Francisco moved deeper into the cave system, where he'd noticed secondary chambers branching from the primary channel. These chambers appeared to contain older ice, demonstrably older based on the coloration and crystalline structure. One chamber in particular caught his attention. The ice walls were unusually clear, almost transparent, and within the ice itself, Francisco could see what appeared to be objects, artifacts embedded within the crystalline structure. He photographed these objects extensively. They appeared to be tools of some kind, primitive implements suggesting human occupation. But that was impossible. These objects were embedded in ice that formation analysis suggested was centuries old, possibly older. The ice surrounding them showed no signs of disturbance, no evidence of a cavity where someone had inserted them. They existed within the ice, as if they'd been there since the ice itself formed. Francisco began collecting temperature data obsessively, photographing every visible anomaly, documenting his increasingly troubled observations in his field notebook. By 11:00 a.m., Francisco attempted radio contact again. Still static, he decided to begin his exit sequence. He'd collected extensive data and samples. Whatever these anomalies represented, they warranted further investigation and laboratory analysis. He retraced his path through the secondary chamber, moving back toward the primary chamber and the exit. But the cave geometry seemed different on his return. Distances seemed elongated. Chamber junctions appeared in unexpected locations. Francisco consulted his survey map and realized something profoundly disturbing. The cave's interior geography appeared to have shifted. The path he'd taken into the cave should have been retraced in precisely reverse. But the cave appeared to have rearranged itself. He continued moving, attempting to remain calm, attempting to maintain scientific objectivity despite growing fear. The ice around him began to exhibit subtle changes. The characteristic blue luminescence grew more intense in certain chambers, less pronounced in others. Some sections of the cave showed warming, visible meltwater beginning to drip from the ceiling despite temperatures that should have prevented any melting. Francisco's equipment registered impossible readings. His thermal cameras showed temperature variations that ranged from negative 30 degrees to above freezing in adjacent ice sections, a differential that shouldn't exist in a stable glacial environment. By approximately 2 p.m., 4 hours after entering the cave, Francisco had not yet found the exit. His radio remained non-functional. His equipment batteries were beginning to show depletion from constant documentation. And most troublingly, he began noticing something within the ice walls themselves. The objects he'd discovered earlier, those primitive tools embedded in ancient ice, seemed to be multiplying. Every chamber he entered contained more of them. Stone implements, bone tools, and something else. Human remains, preserved perfectly in the ice, positioned as if they died within the cave itself centuries or millennia ago. Francisco realized with growing horror that he was not discovering an anomalous ice cave. He was navigating through a glacier that functioned as a tomb, a monument to human habitation that predated any documented settlement in southeast Alaska. And the cave's interior was closing around him, its passages shifting, its temperature fluctuating, its impossible geometry ensuring that anyone entering would find themselves trapped within increasingly narrow and hostile ice chambers. By 4 p.m., Francisco had been inside the ice cave for over 8 hours. His equipment batteries were critically depleted. His thermal camera had ceased functioning. His radio remained inoperable. The cave's interior had become progressively colder, his thermometer now registering negative 38 degrees Celsius, a temperature that shouldn't exist in a glacier environment undergoing active melting. More disturbing, the meltwater that should have been flowing through the cave had disappeared. The channels where water had previously carved through ice were now sealed, refrozen solid with ice that appeared geologically ancient despite the temperature fluctuations suggesting recent formation. Francisco realized that the cave was closing, not gradually, but systematically. Passages he'd traveled through hours earlier were now sealed with fresh ice, creating impassable barriers. The cave geometry was transforming, corridors were narrowing, and his path backward toward the exit was becoming progressively more constrained. He pushed forward, moving deeper into the cave system, hoping to find an alternate route, hoping to discover some passage that would lead him toward escape. At approximately 6:15 p.m., over 10 hours after entering the cave, Francisco discovered something that fundamentally altered his understanding of his situation. He found a complete research station inside the ice cave. Equipment, tents, supplies, all frozen in perfect preservation within a chamber deep inside the glacier. More significantly, he found skeletal remains. Multiple human skeletons arranged in patterns suggesting they had died within this chamber, arranged as if they deliberately positioned themselves before perishing in the cold. Francisco photographed everything compulsively despite his equipment being essentially non-functional, despite his fingers becoming numb, despite his mind fracturing under the implications. The research station contained dated materials. Francisco found expedition records from 1958, another dating from 1937, another from 1901. All of them belonged to glaciologists and researchers who had entered this ice cave under conditions similar to his own, exploring unusual geological formations, documenting anomalies, attempting comprehensive research. All of them had apparently been trapped inside the cave's shifting geometry, unable to find their way out, unable to escape, dying methodically as temperatures dropped and passages sealed around them. Francisco discovered his own expedition permit among the abandoned records. It bore today's date, February 14th, 2018. But it had been sealed inside ice that geological analysis of crystalline formation patterns suggested was decades old. His own permit, preserved in ice, waiting for him to discover it as evidence that he was already dead, already completed, already a historical artifact trapped inside a glacier. The final entry in the 2001 expedition journal, the most recent before his own, described something Francisco now understood. The glacier is not a location. It is an entity. It shows us what we came to see. It shows us objects we are desperate to document. It teaches us through experience and refuses to release us. I understand now that I died days ago. The body walking through this cave is not alive in any conventional sense. The glacier preserves us, and we become part of it. We become the documentation we sought. The ice remembers everything. Francisco stopped trying to escape. He sat down on the ice floor in one of the sealed chambers and simply waited. His body temperature continued dropping. His consciousness began fragmenting. But somewhere in his final moments of awareness, Francisco achieved a strange comprehension. The objects embedded in the ancient ice, the primitive tools, the human remains dating back centuries. These were not historical artifacts. They were future evidence. They were Francisco and researchers from the future, documented within the glacier itself, preserved in ice that existed outside of normal chronological time. When rescue teams finally arrived at the glacier access point, they found only Martin, Francisco's colleague, waiting with a confused expression. Martin reported that Francisco had entered the cave at 7:47 a.m. that morning and had never emerged. But when search and rescue teams examined the glacier, they found no ice cave matching Martin's description. No entrance, no chamber system, no anomalous formation. The glacier appeared completely normal. However, over subsequent months, new ice cores extracted from Mendenhall Glacier revealed something extraordinary. Within the crystalline structure of ice formed centuries ago, ice that had accumulated long before modern glaciology existed, researchers discovered perfectly preserved artifacts. Research equipment, expedition permits dated to modern times, skeleton remains wearing contemporary clothing, and human remains positioned carefully within the ice, preserved in perfect detail, their faces expressing serene acceptance of their fate. Glaciologists studying the cores concluded that the ice's formation patterns suggested these materials had been frozen in place for at least 300 years. Yet, the equipment and clothing showed no degradation consistent with such age. The ice had preserved everything in a state that transcended normal temporal progression. The ice cores were classified and sealed, filed away in university storage facilities. Today, the Mendenhall Glacier continues its recession. Its ice caves appear and disappear seasonally, as they always have. But researchers avoid the glacier. Glaciologists refuse to conduct solitary research, and park officials discourage visitors from approaching the glacier during certain times of year when reports suggest that new ice caves may appear. Caves that shouldn't exist, caves that shouldn't be accessible, caves that seem to generate their own temporal fields where exploration leads not to discovery, but to preservation, to becoming embedded within the ice itself, forever frozen, forever documented, forever waiting for the next researcher foolish enough to enter seeking knowledge. The cemetery's silence was suffocating in a way that Martin didn't expect. Robinson Woods, located in Lawrence, Chicago, had been a documented burial ground since the mid-1800s, when the Robinson family had established a private cemetery on their ancestral land. Over the decades, the forest had grown around the graves, absorbing them. Until now, the cemetery existed as a liminal space, neither fully forest nor fully cultivated. A place where human intention had attempted to impose order on something that had ultimately claimed the space back as its own. Martin was a cemetery preservation specialist, contracted to conduct an after-hours survey of the Robinson Woods site to assess degradation of graves, evaluate preservation needs, and document the overall condition of the burial ground. It was routine work, the kind of professional documentation that Martin conducted monthly throughout the Chicago area. His survey was scheduled for April 23, 1995, beginning at 10 p.m. The Parks Department had approved the after-hours access, though Martin had noted with some curiosity that the rangers seemed unusually reluctant about granting permission. One ranger had mentioned casually that Robinson Woods was officially closed after sunset, that local residents had requested the closure due to unexplained disturbances, and that Martin should complete his work quickly and exit before dawn. Martin had dismissed the concerns. He was a professional. He'd surveyed hundreds of burial grounds without incident. A cemetery was simply a cemetery, a place of rest, not a location of danger. Martin arrived at Robinson Woods at 9:45 p.m., parking his vehicle at the main access point and gathering his equipment. He carried survey instruments, documentation cameras, a powerful flashlight, and his preservation specialist's portable database for recording observations. The night was clear, cool, with a moderate breeze moving through the trees. The forest itself seemed quiet. Normal nocturnal ambiance with occasional animal sounds drifting through the darkness. Martin located the primary grave markers and began his systematic survey, photographing each grave, recording inscription details, and documenting the soil conditions surrounding each burial. The work was absorbing. Martin moved methodically through the cemetery, establishing a grid system to ensure comprehensive coverage. He documented approximately 47 grave markers, recording their condition, making notes about vegetation encroachment, soil erosion, and structural degradation of the stones themselves. By 11:30 p.m., he'd completed approximately 60% of the survey, working his way toward the deeper sections of Robinson Woods, where older graves were located. His documentation was thorough, professional, exactly the kind of detailed assessment that preservation committees depended upon for making decisions about cemetery maintenance and restoration priorities. At 11:47 p.m., Martin noticed something that made him pause in his documentation. His equipment readings were showing inconsistent electromagnetic fluctuations in specific areas of the cemetery. Nothing dramatic or impossible, but unusual enough to warrant investigation. He consulted his instruments and began mapping the areas where the fluctuations were strongest. The pattern formed something unexpected, not random, but geometrically organized. The areas of highest electromagnetic activity formed a perfect circle approximately 30 feet in diameter, encompassing perhaps 8 to 10 grave sites. Martin photographed this phenomenon extensively and began conducting individual documentation of the graves within the circle. As he moved deeper into this section, he noticed something else. The grave markers within the anomalous electromagnetic zone bore no legible inscriptions. The stones were present, weathered, ancient appearing, but the surfaces were worn completely smooth, as if centuries of erosion had obliterated all identifying information. Martin found this curious, but not unprecedented. Time and weather could definitely erase surface inscription details. Yet, something about these particular graves felt different. The soil around them seemed disturbed, recently disturbed, despite being ancient burial sites. At exactly midnight, as Martin was photographing the central grave within the electromagnetic circle, he heard it. A sound like breathing, but not human breathing. Something deeper, something vast, something that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Martin stopped working and held perfectly still, attempting to locate the sound source. It continued, rhythmic, patient, unmistakably present. Martin's rational mind suggested natural phenomena, wind through tree cavities, shifting soil, any explanation that would maintain his worldview as ordered and rational. But his instinctive mind recognized the sound for what it was. Something alive, something beneath the earth, something awareness possessing and attention focused on him. He made the decision to continue his work quickly and complete the survey as efficiently as possible. He'd document the anomalies and report them through proper channels. He photographed the circular grouping of graves with particular intensity, ensuring comprehensive documentation of the electromagnetic fluctuations and the unusually weathered grave markers. His hands were steady despite the tension moving through his body, his professional demeanor intact despite growing discomfort. By 12:45 a.m., Martin had completed documentation of the anomalous grave circle and was beginning to document other grave sites scattered throughout the deeper forest sections. He was moving methodically when he noticed the graves arranging themselves differently than he'd anticipated. Graves that his grid system indicated should be in specific locations appeared in other locations. Or perhaps his sense of spatial orientation had become confused. Martin consulted his positioning instruments and realized something troubling. His instruments weren't providing reliable location data. They were registering his position with inconsistent accuracy, sometimes suggesting he was in locations he could see were incorrect based on visible landmarks. By 1:30 a.m., Martin had accumulated over 300 photographs, hundreds of data points, and an increasingly uncomfortable sense that something about Robinson Woods was resisting his systematic documentation. His equipment had begun showing signs of stress, batteries depleting faster than normal, data becoming corrupted, his recording devices triggering intermittently without his activation, and the breathing sound, that deep, rhythmic exhalation from beneath the earth, had never stopped. It continued, constant, patient, increasingly synchronized with Martin's own heartbeat. At 2:15 a.m., Martin attempted to leave Robinson Woods. He walked toward where he believed his vehicle to be located, following his compass bearing and visual landmarks. But the forest geometry seemed to resist his departure. Paths that should have led toward the access point instead curved back toward the cemetery. Trees arranged themselves in configurations that he should have recognized, but somehow remained unfamiliar. And the grave markers. The grave markers were everywhere now, emerging from beneath the undergrowth, their smooth, weathered surfaces reflecting his flashlight beam. Martin ran. Not panicked, but with determined urgency. He abandoned his systematic survey and pushed through the undergrowth toward where his rational mind insisted the access point should be. Behind him, the breathing sound had intensified. No longer a distant phenomenon, but a palpable presence, as if the earth itself was gasping, drawing breath through 1,000 buried mouths. His flashlight beam bounced wildly as he moved, illuminating grave markers that seemed to be multiplying, emerging from the soil as if the cemetery was expanding outward, consuming more forest with each moment. He burst through a final stand of trees and found himself at the access point. His vehicle was there, exactly where he'd left it. But something fundamental had changed. The parking area was surrounded by grave markers, dozens of them, all arranged in precise geometric patterns, all bearing his name. Not different variations of his name, but identical inscriptions. Martin, with today's date, April 23, 1995. His own grave markers, dozens of duplicates, all surrounding his vehicle, as if they'd been waiting for him. Martin didn't stop to process this impossible phenomenon. He jumped into his vehicle and drove away from Robinson Woods, not stopping until he reached a well-lit convenience store approximately 5 miles distant. He sat in the parking lot for over an hour, collecting himself, attempting to rationalize what he'd experienced. When he finally reviewed his equipment, he discovered that something extraordinary had occurred during his survey. His thermal imaging camera, the device had been malfunctioning all evening, had recorded data despite showing no visible readout. When Martin reviewed the footage, he found video evidence of something impossible. The cemetery existed in the thermal imaging as a completely different landscape. The graves Martin had documented appeared on camera as they should, thermal signatures showing cold earth and ancient stone. But the space between the graves, the supposedly empty spaces of forest floor, showed thermal signatures indicating human bodies. Dozens of them, hundreds of them. Lying beneath the soil, their body heat still registering despite death that suggested they'd been buried for decades or centuries. The thermal camera had seen what visual light could not, that Robinson Woods was not merely a cemetery. It was a mass grave, containing far more bodies than any historical record documented, far more remains than any physical survey should have revealed. More disturbing, the thermal imaging showed something else. As Martin had moved through the cemetery conducting his survey, the bodies beneath the soil had been moving. Not grossly, not dramatically, but gradually shifting position, rotating, reorganizing. And in the final minutes of recorded footage, as Martin was attempting to exit the cemetery, the thermal signatures showed all the bodies turning in unison, all facing the direction of the access point, all oriented toward Martin's position. Hundreds of buried people, their bodies animated by something, all turning their focus toward the man conducting the preservation survey. Martin filed his preliminary report with the Parks Department the next morning, documenting the electromagnetic anomalies and the grave marker degradation, but omitting all details about the impossible phenomena and the thermal imaging evidence. He refused the offered contract renewal for Robinson Woods and withdrew from cemetery preservation work entirely. He relocated to California and maintained strict silence about his experience. Until 2003, when he published a carefully worded academic paper suggesting that certain cemetery locations might be generating electromagnetic phenomena that could influence researcher perception and equipment function. The paper was dismissed as speculative, but colleagues noticed that Martin had become obsessive about one particular detail. He repeatedly measured his own body temperature and heart rate, maintaining logs that he refused to share, recording data that seemed to consume his attention. In 2007, Martin died suddenly. The medical examiner found nothing physically wrong. His heart had simply stopped. But the autopsy revealed something unusual. Markings on Martin's internal organs. Marks that resembled inscription details, names, and dates carved into his heart tissue, his lungs, his liver. Markings that matched the grave inscriptions from Robinson Woods. It was as if the cemetery had written itself into, his body had documented itself within his flesh. Robinson Woods remains closed after sunset. Park officials maintain the closure due to historical preservation concerns. But rangers who have worked the location privately report that the cemetery has been growing. More grave markers emerge each year. More areas show signs of disturbance. And occasionally, particularly on nights when the electromagnetic readings spike, Hikers report encountering a man who looks remarkably like photograph records of Martin conducting surveys of graves that don't appear on any official maps. He moves through Robinson Woods methodically, photographing grave markers, recording data, searching for something he can never quite locate. Some rangers have reported that the grave markers visible in those nighttime encounters all bear the same inscription: Martin, repeated hundreds of times, as if the cemetery is completing its documentation, as if it's recording his presence across multiple graves, multiple deaths, multiple temporal instances. The thermal imaging evidence from Martin's original survey was lost, officially destroyed in a records management purge. But copies survived in university archives. Anyone who has viewed the footage reports similar phenomena. The bodies beneath Robinson Woods continue to move within the footage, even when viewed years later, as if the video itself is a living thing, as if the cemetery's animation extends beyond physical space into documentation, into evidence, into any place that contains information about what Robinson Woods truly is. Today, Robinson Woods remains as it has for over 150 years. A cemetery in Chicago's Lawrence area, officially closed after dark, unofficially recognized as a location where the living should not conduct systematic documentation. Whatever inhabits the soil beneath those graves, whatever animated the bodies beneath the earth, it appears to be patient. It appears to be waiting. And it appears to be recording its own documentation through the deaths of those foolish enough to survey it. If you've made it this far through these 11 disappearances from America's most haunted forests, you understand that some mysteries refuse simple explanation. Some phenomena exist at the intersection of the documented and the impossible. These cases remain officially unsolved, their evidence locked away, their details sanitized for public consumption. But they happened. They continue to happen. For more investigations into the disappearances that haunt our forests, the encounters that defy explanation, and the mysteries that official channels refuse to acknowledge, visit Verified Fears on YouTube. We document what others won't investigate. We preserve what agencies want forgotten. We believe that the truth, no matter how disturbing, deserves to be heard. Subscribe to Verified Fears and join thousands of viewers exploring the boundaries between the natural world and something far stranger. The forest remembers, and we're here to tell you what it remembers. For business inquiries and paid promotions, contact us at verifiedfearsthemail.com.